Hi, welcome back guys. This is your Sensei, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Naruto Fought the Infected Apocalypse? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The sky was completely dark, black, and the rain fell hard over the city, allowing anyone to see only as far as their own nose. Wind drove the rain into the parked vehicles scattered along the street, long abandoned. Windows that had once been intact were now shattered, and where glass remained it bore faint cracks. Dust that had coated the cars had turned to mud in the downpour, the neglected metal. The city itself was abandoned. Plants had reclaimed sidewalks and lampposts. Wild and untamed, vegetation pushed up through cracks in the streets and walls, spreading across blocks and along buildings until some structures had partially collapsed from long neglect and the invasion of roots. The storm did not seem to deter the growth. Thunder briefly lit the sky and masked other, softer sounds that would have made people shiver if the rain and thunder did not already do so. For a short moment the thunder hushed and the rain eased until drops felt like light caresses. In that minute a sudden, deafening boom shattered the silence, then snapping noises returned. The rain intensified again, and the lightning flared brighter than before. In that flash 4 figures were seen emerging from a building and running up the street, dodging abandoned cars and leaping over rubble. Each of the 4 carried a large, pocketed, military-style backpack showing signs of wear. They wore dark, olive or military green clothing and had firearms in hand, outside of the holsters on their bodies. At the head of the group was a red-headed man with a tangled beard and greasy shoulder-length hair. He wore a heavy green coat and held what looked like a sawed-off shotgun, a large backpack weighing him down. He stopped at a fork in the road and turned to catch his breath, not exactly unfit but hardly in peak condition, gently moving his left arm as if his shoulder bothered him. A brown-haired woman with her hair tied in a bun reached him first. She was 2 heads shorter than the redhead, with chocolate eyes and a dirty, heart-shaped face. Her backpack bulged behind her and she carried a slightly rusted assault rifle with place-worn marks that did not seem to trouble either her or the red-headed man. A younger man, likely in his late teens, with black hair, gray eyes, and pale skin came next, followed by a young woman a little over 20 with black hair and gray eyes like the young man's, but with slightly darker skin and a harder, more angular face. They lingered for a few minutes, keeping their backs to each other and watching the path they'd come from. The storm's noise made it hard to hear anything else and prevented them from moving confidently toward a known safe area, so every decision could be critical. Christopher, the redhead, focused on the route they had taken and squinted into the darkness. He tightened his grip on the shotgun as if he sensed something watching them. Christopher's voice was hoarse as he said they had to meet Marlene in Boston and make sure the cargo reached the Fireflies base as planned. He swallowed hard before continuing that they had to deliver the materials. Gwen, the brown-haired woman, spat that they could even get out of there and cursed the situation, blaming Christopher for their danger. The young woman warned Gwen to stop shouting, afraid their noise would draw attention, and reminded Christopher that she still wanted to live a little longer. William, the pale, younger man, shrugged but did not meet anyone's eyes. He looked more frightened than the others. Fresh blood marked his face in small droplets. Gwen blamed Anna for leaving William exposed, saying that because of him Fred was dead. Anna snapped that it was not William's fault and that it had been his first mission. The narrator noted that all 4 belonged to the Fireflies, the rebel group fighting Fedra and the totalitarian military governments inside the quarantine zones. Christopher had been with them for 2 years. Anna had been with them longer, since she had escaped from a quarantine zone as a child. William had just joined and this was his first operation. During the mission an infected had attacked Fred, and Gwen had been forced to shoot him to prevent him from turning. Christopher hardened his voice and said it was not the time or place for reproaches. He told Gwen and Anna to leave the arguments for later and addressed William, assuring him they would talk afterward and instructing him to steady his weapon now. With that, the 4 began to move again. Christopher chose the right-hand path. There were not many cars visible and the grass had not grown as tall as on other streets, so they could move much faster than they would have on the other road. Both lanes seemed to lead north, exactly where they needed to go to get toward Boston, where Marlene was supposed to be waiting. Christopher took the lead, placing himself at the front of the line as they threaded between the few vehicles in the area. He gripped his shotgun tightly and kept his eyes fixed forward. The brothers in the middle watched left and right, scanning alleys and side streets for any sign of movement so they would not be caught by a surprise attack. Gwen kept glancing back every few steps, holding her weapon and breathing with the tightness of someone on edge. Her hands were steady but tense. Then, in an instant, it happened. Something shifted in the shadows and an old trash can clattered to the ground, the noise sharp enough that all four of them swung their weapons toward the sound at the same time. Barrels pointed into the dark, wet alley, but nothing was visible. Christopher assumed the wind or the push of water had toppled the bin. He eased the shotgun down and let out a long breath, ready to continue north. Something leapt at him from behind one of the parked cars and struck his neck. A sudden, searing pain forced a shout from him. He spun and fired at the attacker, the shot hitting the creature's head and stopping it, but another assailant had already plunged into the group. Christopher stumbled back and fell against a rotten bench that gave way under his weight, driving him down onto his knee. He reached for the wound and felt the warmth of blood soaking his fingers and running into his clothing. Anna looked on with alarm and fear, noting the severity of his injury and fearing the worst. Christopher tried to steady himself and insisted that it did not matter, forcing himself to stand with fierce determination and saying that he still had hours to get them out of the city and that Marlene would be waiting. His words cut off as a tide of infected surged from the surrounding shadows. The creatures crashed into their companions like a wave, dragging people down and overwhelming them even as gunfire started to replace the distant rumble of thunder. The attackers moved with a terrifying relentlessness, closing in on Gwen and the others and forcing the survivors to fight desperately to keep them back. The rain darkened with splashes of red where wounds had been opened, tinting puddles and pavement as chaos unfolded. Christopher cursed and fired, his shots knocking two attackers back and separating them from Gwen. Straining against the pain, he trained his shotgun on another approaching infected. Before he could pull the trigger, one of the creatures bit into him from behind, forcing him to lower the weapon. He grit his teeth and shouted a challenge, refusing to give in. An arrow suddenly thudded into the attacker's forehead, felling it. The elongated lodged and stopped the assault. More of that same silent accuracy followed. Another metallic sound on a roof, another thud, and two more attackers were brought down by similar projectiles. That allowed Christopher to drop down and press his hand to the first wound, which had worsened when he was bitten a second time. Sitting there and bleeding, Christopher noticed the arrows, woodenness fletched with 3 black feathers. He turned his head and saw who had shot them. A young man stood with a hood pulled up and a cloth mask covering the lower half of his face, a few blonde strands escaping the hood. He was tall, about 6 feet, neither thin nor bulky, with the handle of a sheathed sword visible on his back beside a quiver of arrows. Christopher struggled to speak and laughed hoarsely, coughing and spitting blood. He said that he did not think he would recover and then scoffed that the group they called the Fireflies could not fight the infection. The hooded young man looked at the pendant around Christopher's neck and observed that the Fireflies fought for freedom. He said that he did not believe in the rebellion or in politics, that he did not believe in the idea of a perfectly free world and that fighting the way they did was pointless. Christopher grinned through the blood and insisted that they could not win against the infection alone. He ripped off his pendant and offered it to the stranger, asking him to take it to Marlene in Boston. The hooded man refused the pendant and then muttered that he did not do favors or deliveries. Christopher pressed that if it was the wish of a dying man, the stranger should honor it. The hooded youth's eyes widened at that, and before he could respond, a single gunshot cracked through the night and a dull thud followed. Christopher had shot himself. The young man spat a curse, looking down at the bodies of the 4 Fireflies. He pulled his hood back and lowered his mask, revealing disheveled blonde hair and a sharp, lean face. His blue eyes swept the ruined street with cool appraisal as he muttered that he did not understand why he kept running into people who were already dead. He picked up the pendant, pressed it to his palm, and considered the small metal symbol of their cause. It was not a simple pendant with the Firefly symbol. It was a locket whose photograph of a girl looked back at him for a few seconds before he closed it instinctively. He murmured that it was a final wish for his daughter as he tucked the locket into the folds of his clothing, and, thinking of Boston, decided he could change his course a little. Lincoln was a small town in Amherst County, Massachusetts, a few miles north of Boston, now empty and silent. Its houses stood vacant, facades worn by time 20 years since the infection had appeared. Dust-covered, rusting cars filled the streets, abandoned and falling apart. Vegetation had taken over wherever it could, plants already present growing wild and filling every gap, giving Lincoln a neglected, overgrown look. The state of the buildings and the absence of living people turned the town into a ghost town, one more among many. The Cordyceps infection had reduced the world population to only a few 100,000 people, and many cities were abandoned and reclaimed by wildlife. Only those with nothing to lose ventured into these empty streets. With the appearance of the infected, the people who still moved through towns like Lincoln were smugglers, raiders, or strange groups searching for a way to survive. Ordinary people, the most fearful, remained hidden inside quarantine zones, protected and controlled by the military. Despite the danger, abandoned towns could hold the resources needed to survive, making them suitable places for smart survivor groups to settle if they could handle the infected that prowled streets and buildings like silent predators. Not everyone trusted the government. Some people remained in abandoned towns, and Lincoln was no exception. It still had one living person walking its streets, surviving alone. Paranoia and a desire to avoid the government and military had led that person to fill Lincoln with traps in every alley, street, and corner. Lincoln was small but held a surprisingly large number of infected compared with some larger towns, so it was easy for the careless to die at the slightest mistake. That did not happen to its lone resident, thanks to improvised traps and a stubborn mistrust of the authorities. Bill, the only living person in Lincoln, was paranoid and solitary, a competent scavenger when the Cordyceps outbreak began. That reputation earned him enemies, and he had become the one person others would reluctantly rely on when they visited Lincoln, though Bill always preferred to be left alone. He trusted neither strangers nor longtime partners, and to him, anyone who entered Lincoln was a potential future threat. Despite this, he repaid favors when owed. Being the only person left made Bill the hub everyone had to pass through if they wanted to move through the town. He knew where all the traps were set, where the larger groups of infected gathered, and where the remaining resources lay if he had not already taken them for himself. A pair of survivors arrived looking for help. Joel Miller and Ellie Williams had been forced to head to Lincoln to find a vehicle that could take them to the Fireflies after discovering that the rebels were not at the first meeting point at the Capitol. Joel had been assigned to bring Ellie, a teenage girl, to the rebels. He had promised his partner, before she died, that he would see it done. Joel knew Bill was the only person who could help, since Bill owed him favors from past jobs. They found Bill. His traps were scattered throughout the town, and unprepared visitors could be caught and killed by the infected. Joel had always met Bill at checkpoints closer to Boston and had never actually entered Lincoln before, so he did not know the layout of traps and barricades. When he first encountered one of Bill's traps, Joel ended up hanging from it while infected approached. Ellie cut the rope to free him. Joel used his revolver to put down several infected before Ellie freed him, but he landed awkwardly and hurt his right arm slightly, which made it harder for him to aim at another infected that had lunged close. Bill intervened, swinging his machete with a precise, ruthless motion and neutralizing the attacker without graphic detail. Bill then confronted them angrily for having destroyed his traps on their way to find him, a complaint Joel understood. They had disabled many of Bill's defenses and left a clear path straight to his position, creating more work and forcing Bill to use resources he might otherwise have saved. After several minutes of heated exchange, Bill forgave Joel. Bill scolded them for the mess but agreed to help. The three of them set out to find a battery from a military truck to get one of the town's cars running again. Bill made it clear that once the job was done, all his debts to Joel would be completely settled, and Joel agreed. A working battery was too valuable in these times. The three of them slipped past the infected and moved from the church, the building that doubled as Bill's weapons cache, to one of the small town schools, where they took shelter and tried to keep the pursuing infected at bay. Bill called for the doors to be closed above the ins and shuffles echoing through the halls. Joel turned and fired a shot that struck an infected in the head, sending it sprawling several meters, then followed Ellie, urging her toward what looked like the gym. Wooden crates were scattered across the floor, a sign that someone had used the place as a temporary refuge early in the outbreak, likely under government or military guidance. Bill barreled into a door at the far end of the gym, but the door did not budge. They were trapped. Another shot reverberated off the walls, and an infected collapsed where it had stood, the impact marking the gym floor. They were still in danger. The noise had drawn attention from every direction, and the gunfire was lighting up the area to other infected nearby. Joel and Bill both knew that shooting made escape far more difficult. The safest kills were done quietly with blades, bows, or suppressed firearms. Loud weapons attracted worse things, the mutated infected that barely registered bullets and became deadly threats themselves. Ellie pointed to the only clear exit, a window above some bleachers, half covered with a dusty blue tarp. Sunlight filtered through, and for now there were no infected trying to get in there. Bill warned that it was their only way out and moved to the bleachers to try to open the window as fast as possible, ordering Joel to deal with the infected around them. Joel growled his disapproval but kept firing, preferring headshots that would stop the infection for good. He had learned the hard way that shots to limbs or the torso could leave an infected able to keep moving. As Joel worked, he checked his ammo and discovered, too late, that he had only 3 shotgun shells left, the last of what Bill had given him at the church. He cursed softly, loaded the 3 rounds, then drew his revolver and fired a precise shot that dropped another infected. A sudden crash drew their attention. The door Bill had tried earlier had been forced open. Joel watched as a massive infected shoved the door apart with sheer brute strength. It was covered in thick, bumpy growths that sometimes released drifting spores. The creature's size and hardened flesh marked it as a late-stage infection, with greater strength and resistance than the others. Bill shouted for Joel to stop staring and move. Joel swore under his breath and ran toward the bleachers where Ellie and Bill had been climbing, but the bloater was faster than he had expected. It smashed into the bleachers with a force that made the timbers creak and give way, and Joel had to leap back and take aim over the collapsing planks. The bloater's growths acted like natural armor. Small-caliber weapons often failed to stop them. To defeat one required high PNTRTN weapons, explosives, or fire. The bloater staggered out of the wreckage, focusing on Joel, who was the nearest target. It launched itself forward, each step thudding against the gym floor. Joel fired. The round hit the creature but did not slow its charge. It plowed through nearby crates, eyes fixed on Joel. Ellie tried to move back toward the gym entrance, terrified, and Bill grabbed her by the waist and pulled her away. Both of them watched the infected continue to lunge at Joel, angrier than it first appeared, clearly upset with whoever had shot it. Then another window shattered inward and 2 projectiles struck the bulky infected, stopping it for a moment. The projectiles detonated in that instant, producing a concussive blast that knocked the creature back and allowed Joel to slip free from its grasp. Joel wondered who it was. Joel, Ellie, and Bill turned toward the new arrival who had climbed in through the window the projectiles had broken. He was nearly 6 feet tall with messy blonde hair. He held a bow in his right hand and kept another arrow ready in his left. The young man ordered Joel to move aside. He raised the bow and Joel moved away from the bulky infected, which had refocused on the newcomer. The boy released an arrow that shot in with a sharp crack. The arrow struck between heavy folds of the infected skin and then detonated, blowing part of its right arm free and momentarily disabling it. The youth hissed that the creature was too tough and took 2 more arrows from his quiver. The infected swung its left arm toward him, but the boy rolled to the right and fired another arrow in a crouch. The arrow detonated on impact before penetrating, sending the infected crashing into the wall. The boy warned that he could not use larger explosives and told Joel to shoot where the last arrow had exploded. Joel focused and followed the instruction. He aimed with his left eye and fired his shotgun, the blast disabling the infected further and destroying the area the explosive arrow had struck. The boy shouted for Joel to move now. He ran toward the debris. Beneath the window with Joel on his heels, tossed his bow through the opening, and then leapt out of the gym. He turned back, grabbed Joel, and yanked him out at the precise moment the doors burst open and infected poured into the room. Joel wondered who the boy was. Bill growled that this was not the place and ordered them to follow. The four left the school as fast as they could, running down narrow streets, dodging abandoned cars and debris, and avoiding any further encounters with infected. At last they reached a house. Bill shoved them inside and slammed the door shut. Bill said they had been lucky. Joel held his revolver up toward the boy's face and Bill mirrored the action. Joel nudged Ellie behind him. Ellie noticed a pendant swinging from the boy's neck. Bill demanded to know who he was and what he was doing in their town. The boy dropped his quiver and bow and introduced himself as Naruto Uzumaki, saying he was heading to Boston to find Marlene. At the mention of the Fireflies' leader, Joel's hand trembled and Bill glanced at him for a split second. In that instant the boy used his elbow to shove Joel's arm upward, dislodging the revolver, spun, and kneed Bill in the stomach, sending him down with his shotgun across his lap. Bill called the boy out, and the boy said he did not like being threatened with a gun. Joel and the boy pointed their weapons at each other. Joel had not noticed when the boy had produced a pistol, but now it was steady in his hand, aimed at Joel's head. Joel took in the boy's appearance, a green military-style t-shirt layered over a short-sleeved black shirt, black tactical pants, black boots, and a holster strapped to his right leg and to a belt with several pouches. The boy's face was sharp, his eyes a vivid blue, and the Firefly's pendant hung at his throat. Joel lowered his arm and the boy did the same. Ellie exhaled and Bill grunted. The boy offered to deliver Marlene's package if Joel provided it. Naruto said the story was long but that he wanted to find Marlene and believed they could help each other. The Fireflies were a rebel group that had formed to oppose the militarized quarantine zones. They fought the military and other factions that seemed to limit people's freedoms. Even in the brutal new world ruled by survival of the fittest, the Fireflies promised a different future, and some people still believed in their message. That belief held steady until the battle in Boston. Despite their promises, the Fireflies were losing members and resources. The group seemed to be placing all their hopes on a single young girl of 14, a girl in whom Marlene had invested the organization's future for reasons most people did not understand. Naruto suspected Joel knew why Marlene had kept certain information secret and that this was the reason they were all searching for the rebels. They sat in the dust-filled living room of one of the small town's houses. Bill had secured the doors and windows and watched Naruto warily, remembering how easily the boy had struck him and nearly disarmed Joel. That action had surprised both men. They had not met anyone with such immense fighting skill and had been taken by surprise, which had caused the earlier scene. Naruto was relaxed, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His weapon lay on the table, the magazine set aside and the chambered round standing upright and pointing at the ceiling to reassure Bill and Joel that he would not fire. But he was not the only one who had set down his guns. Joel had placed his revolver to one side, empty of its 6 rounds, and Bill had laid his shotgun at the other end of the table with all the shells stacked in a small pile. The only one who had not left anything was Ellie. She was unarmed, and Naruto did not see her as a threat when he remembered how she had reacted in the earlier confrontation. None of them mentioned the fight at the house entrance or the confrontation in the gym against the infected, so Joel and Bill had not properly thanked the boy. Their eyes still held a cautious resentment, as if they were waiting for a move. Naruto could not blame them. In an apocalyptic world, trust was rare. No one should trust anyone, not even a small 15-year-old girl. At the thought of her, Naruto glanced at Ellie from the corner of his eye. Thin, red hair tied in a ponytail, dirt on her skin and green eyes that watched him with a wary interest, like a frightened kitten. After looking at her, he turned his attention to Bill. Bill had gray hair combed back and a trimmed beard of the same color. Wrinkles marked his forehead and his small eyes were far more wary than the girl's, making it clear the man was much more distrustful and potentially dangerous. One false move and Bill would likely have no hesitation to shoot him in the back. Bill was paranoid and distrustful. Joel's hair was shorter but the same gray. His beard was fuller and his face showed many cuts and small burns from long hours under the sun. Comparing them, Joel had a more athletic build, probably from being on the move constantly, and that made him feel more dangerous in a different way. Bill's paranoia suggested sudden violence, while Joel's measured calm suggested someone who weighed each step carefully. Both were watching and calculating. The situation was understandable given the world they lived in and what had happened less than half an hour earlier in the gym and at the house entrance. Who would waste resources to help 3 strangers escape the infected, especially one described as chubby? Only altruists and fools would do so, which made Naruto one of the two in Bill's eyes. Bill remained skeptical and tempted to reach for his shotgun. Naruto eased the tension first by stepping away from the wall, letting the men see that his height was nearly Joel's, surprising for an adolescent. Joel noticed the boy's physical condition, an athletic body without signs of malnutrition or dehydration, no excess fat, the look of someone who had eaten a balanced diet. That was odd. Quarantine zones rarely provided varied or balanced food, and many people showed signs of deficiency. Rations led to survival eating, but Naruto showed none of those signs, so Joel concluded the boy did not belong to any quarantine area or to the Fireflies. Naruto looked far better cared for than the rebels, which made him stranger. Ellie broke the tense silence by expressing gratitude for the help in the gym and stating that if it had not been for him, Joel would probably be dead. Bill responded with a wary tone, his eyes drifting constantly toward the shotgun and the pile of shells, making clear how much he wanted the weapon in his hands and how exposed he felt without it. Joel also expressed his thanks and said that he would likely have died without Naruto. Naruto gave a small smile and shrugged, indicating that helping was nothing and that he had been passing through on his way to Boston. Joel told Naruto that Marlene was no longer in Boston and watched him closely for any revealing reaction. Naruto admitted that he had hoped to find someone who knew where Marlene was and explained that he was headed to Boston to look for any trace of the Fireflies. He clarified that he did not need to find Marlene herself, any lower-ranking member would be useful, perhaps more so, because those at the bottom feared losses more acutely. Joel stated that there was nothing left of the Fireflies in Boston, that the army had erased all traces and driven Marlene and her people out of the city, and that this was why he was searching for any clue to her whereabouts. Joel was not entirely truthful. He had already reached a conclusion about how to find her and who could help, but he did not want to mention it in front of a stranger, especially one who knew of the Fireflies and of Ellie's existence. He wondered whether Marlene had told all her group members about the girl. Joel found it strange and narrowed his eyes at Naruto when a fleeting thought slipped into his mind for a few seconds. Maybe Naruto was lying, maybe he was not one of the Fireflies or not his brother's age. If he were a member he should know about Ellie, yet he did not. Joel pointed out that Naruto was unaware of the girl, and Naruto met his stare without flinching. Naruto explained that he was not part of the central group but from a southern cell. He said his cell had been wiped out by the army and that he needed to find a new place to continue fighting the government, which would explain why he did not know about Ellie. Joel reflected that the Fireflies did operate in cells, which made them hard to eliminate completely, but he still wondered why Marlene had seemed desperate when she handed Ellie over and kept the weapons. He doubted Naruto's membership and whether the Fireflies were large enough to have so many sections nationwide, but he had no proof to call Naruto a liar. Naruto described how he had located Marlene in Boston. Each Firefly's cell kept the leader's coordinates, and his commander had kept those details in a safe beneath the floor. Naruto said he had used that information to trace her and that members from another section had sent him toward Boston. Naruto's eyes brightened slightly as he told the half-truth. Joel suspected that while Firefly's contacts had provided information, it had not been given peacefully and the red-haired man had not been the source before he died. Bill reacted with scorn, calling Naruto another fanatic and urging Joel to shoot him so they could get on with finding the battery and send him out of the town. Joel's expression hardened as he looked to Bill and challenged the idea of killing an adolescent. Bill insisted he would shoot him because the boy was in his town and he did not want Fireflies around. Naruto laughed aloud at the suggestion. He then quieted himself and said that the idea of killing him was absurd and almost insisted it would be simpler to end him and avoid the interrogation. He added that he could pass as a Firefly and slip into posts without being mistakenly shot. Joel blinked and weighed the claim. He countered that killing Naruto could invite Marlene's retribution and that Naruto could serve as leverage. Naruto argued that he was useful and had even saved Joel earlier. He moved to the table, retrieved a Glock, loaded a magazine, inserted it, and holstered the pistol at his thigh. Bill asked Joel if he was going to let Naruto go. Joel asked whether Bill wanted him killed and brought up whether Naruto had ever saved his life. The two men exchanged tense looks that revealed their opposing stances. After a short standoff, Bill relented with a grunt, took up his shotgun, and loaded it with visible reluctance, warning that if Naruto was shot by the back, it would be Joel's fault. Joel admitted he did not fully trust Naruto, but he could not justify killing him either. He decided that Naruto would come with them and Ellie, loading cartridges into the cylinder of his revolver as he warned that any misstep would be fatal. Naruto accepted the condition with a rueful smile and insisted he would be useful to them. Later, on the dusty table in the abandoned house's living room, Naruto emptied his backpack and laid out his supplies to take inventory. He had used several explosive arrows when rescuing Joel from infected and now had only a couple left, so he resolved to save them for another time and place. Using them in the open would reduce their effectiveness, and they were not powerful enough to wipe out an entire pursuing group, so they had limited use. Beside the arrows, magazines for his Glock were stacked and filled with rounds. There was also a box of 9mm ammunition suitable for refilling magazines. Naruto had packed his supplies with care from the start. Maybe it was crazy to carry a box full of 9mm rounds, but it was much better than filling his pockets with magazines and constantly swapping them out. Having one box of ammunition and 5 magazines, including the one already in the pistol, was far superior to changing magazines all the time, especially when replacements were hard to find. Ammunition was scarce, and using whatever they found efficiently was crucial to surviving. Naruto had learned that in the worst moments, and since then he always carried boxes of rounds in his pack and had taught himself to reload magazines without help. Next to the box and the magazines, he had placed a spare Glock, the same color, model, and caliber as the one in his holster, perfect for replacing the one he carried if he ever had to abandon it. But the backpack did not hold only bullets, arrows, and guns. A sheathed katana had been slung to the strap, its dark, worn hilt faded by time. Some infected were slower than others, and a blade was the best way to avoid attracting unwanted attention. With clickers becoming more dangerous because of their echolocation, using edged weapons had become almost mandatory for anyone leaving the quarantine zones. A sword would not stop a horde, something Naruto and many others knew, but it was useful in a small fight against a few infected, and it helped save. Bullets. Beside the katana, on the other side of the military pack, Naruto had placed all his rations, canned food, some recent meat from animals wrapped in a cloth, and a large bag of jerky alongside military rations taken from one of the quarantine zones. That was all the food he needed. Sitting at the table, Naruto began listing the supplies he had lost on the trip to Boston so he could replace them and get everything back to how it had been before he left. Bill and Joel were arguing in another room. Bill had proven to be paranoid, distrustful, and far more surly than he first appeared, complaining about everything as if his orders were the only way to survive in the city. To an extent, Naruto agreed with Bill. The man knew where traps had been set and which places were most dangerous. But Bill had crossed a line. They had not found the battery they needed for the car, and now they had to find another means of transportation. Naruto had suggested hijacking another military truck, but the idea had been rejected. Military convoys avoided the city because of the large number of infected and made wide detours to reach Boston, something everyone understood. Returning to Boston was out of the question for obvious reasons. Without a vehicle, searching for the Fireflies was too dangerous a journey. Traveling across the United States on foot under the current conditions was one of the most dangerous missions imaginable and not recommended. Various survivor groups had formed outside the quarantine zones, each with strange behaviors that sometimes included cannibalism. Add the infected to that, and the probability of surviving the trip fell well below 50%. Even so, he had made it this far. Naruto scratched the back of his neck with uncertainty and resumed filling his pack while waiting for Joel and Bill. He could hear the muffled shouts from the other side of the house. Bill seemed genuinely angry and was not leaving Joel many options in the argument. He took a deep breath and racked the slide of the Glock, watching the part move back and comply with no obstruction. For the first shot with a fresh magazine, the shooter had to pull the slide back to chamber a round. Afterward, the slide cycled on its own with each shot, letting the shooter focus on aiming. Not something a normal person learned on the street, but Naruto had not been raised only on the streets and was not ordinary. He finished and holstered the pistol just as Ellie entered the living room wearing a smile. Ellie announced that they had found the battery, and there was no lie in her eyes or in the faintly genuine brightness of her smile. Naruto and Ellie held each other's gaze for a long moment. He realized he felt a genuine gladness at finding someone close to his age. According to Joel, Ellie was about 2 years younger, around 14, while Naruto was nearly 17 and would turn 17 on October. Naruto raised an eyebrow skeptically and waited for Ellie to explain how they had obtained the battery for the car. It was supposed to be missing from the military truck. Someone had taken it before they arrived. If it had been found, it would be in the garage of that house, where Joel and Bill were arguing. Ellie shrugged and explained that the battery had been in a car in the garage, a friend of Bill's, she thought. She had not paid much attention to who Frank was. Bill and Joel continued their dispute in the other room, and Naruto returned to his inventory, ticking off what needed replacing and making plans for when they were ready to leave. Joel and Bill had started arguing shortly after separating from Naruto, and Ellie did not intend to listen for long, so she rummaged through the garage looking for something useful. Naruto reached for his backpack strap and said that they should get moving and asked what they were waiting for. When Naruto and Ellie arrived at the garage, Joel and Bill had finished their argument. Both men were installing a battery in the truck and stowing a few jerry cans of gasoline in the bed in case they ran out of fuel during the trip. Joel turned when he heard the garage door and looked at the two teenagers for a few seconds. Joel suggested that Ellie get into the driver's seat, tossing his shirt and indicating he did not want to be stuck in the cab if the truck filled with infected. They pushed the truck out of the garage, but it still would not start properly. Naruto had checked the battery before allowing them to attempt to start the engine. Joel proposed that Bill and Naruto push while Ellie turned the key, and when it caught they would climb into the bed and drive away. Naruto refused to be one of the pushers. He took a pistol from his holster and told them he would keep the infected at bay. He believed he had the best chance of surviving a fight and protecting the others. Bill grumbled but moved to the rear of the truck to push. Joel followed suit at his side. Naruto watched the street carefully. He thought that trying to start the truck would attract infected from every direction and that each attempt would draw more attention. He did not say it kindly. He did not like working in a team, but the urgency in his voice made it clear he intended to stay and cover them. The first infected appeared quickly. Standing in the middle of the street, pushing a heavy vehicle, they were easy targets. The infected lunged like predators, and the noise of gunfire only encouraged more to come. Naruto fired, stopping the first infected before it reached the truck, and it collapsed a short distance away. He spun, fired at 3 more, and when a fourth leapt at him he pressed the barrel to its throat and fired, dropping it instantly. He drew his katana in a fluid motion and used it to fend off another wave, each move precise and controlled rather than frenzied. He fired a round at an infected emerging from a porch and then struck another down with a clean cut, the motions almost balletic in how quickly he moved from one target to the next. He kept breathing, focusing on timing and balance. The blade flashed as he used it to push an attacker off balance and then fired a second shot to finish another. The street swelled with approaching infected, but Naruto did not let them close in. He kept pushing them back, moving with the confident efficiency of someone who had done this more times than he wished to admit. When the truck finally started and moved, Naruto vaulted into the bed and sheathed his katana. Joel offered him a shirt, noting that he was soaked. Naruto accepted the shirt silently and used it to wipe his face, removing the dark stains on his skin and clothing. The smell clung to him, but this was not the first time he had dealt with it. Joel asked how long he had been living like this. Naruto lowered his shoulders and placed his katana in his lap, using Joel's shirt to wipe the blade clean of stains. He said that he had been doing it for too long and that he had learned there were only 2 choices, live or die. He wanted to live. Pittsburgh had not escaped the ravages of time. Without the care of the people who had once lived there, buildings showed wear and facades had begun to crumble. Vegetation had taken over the streets, and abandoned vehicles lined the roads, their bodies rusted, dusty, and tires decayed. Any vehicle that still worked would be a slide of luck after 20 years of disuse. Batteries were likely dead or badly damaged. Like many other cities, Pittsburgh had been under the full control of the military and Fedra at the start of the outbreak and remained so for a while. However, the lack of food and other supplies had sparked uprisings in the city, driving ordinary people to fight the army and Fedra agents to try to seize control. The uprising was crushed, leaving many dead in the streets and many more arrested. Public executions were held to set an example, and the population seethed with indignation. The residents of Pittsburgh were tired and hungry and believed the army was deceiving them and that Fedra was hoarding supplies. This discontent was not unique to Pittsburgh. Similar unrest had erupted in other quarantine zones and cities. People were frustrated with the incompetence of those who were supposed to protect them. The Fireflies took advantage of that unrest. Pittsburgh filled with skirmishes once more, with many wounded and dead, and the rebels pushed the army back toward the river, slowly taking control of the city where they had once lived. They felt grim satisfaction at driving out soldiers who had turned against their neighbors. After months of street fighting, the rebels finally seized the city, forcing the army and Fedra out and executing the Fireflies so the inhabitants could govern Pittsburgh themselves without outside influence. Knowing what had happened in Pittsburgh helped to anticipate what the group might encounter in certain districts. The rebels still lived in Pittsburgh, controlling pockets of the city with relatively few infected. They probably lacked adequate supplies to survive alone without aid from another settlement or quarantine zone, which made them dangerous. They might be taking supplies from other survivors by force or hunting them down. As they approached the city, Naruto kept those possibilities in mind to stay alert, focused, and ready in case they were ambushed by scavengers or rebels turned predatory. It would not be surprising if the rebels now hunted every outsider who arrived in Pittsburgh and if they had become savage. Very few people had the skills, knowledge, or will to survive alone, to grow food or hunt for provisions. They lived in a devastated world full of despair and pain. Naruto thought they would likely have sentries watching for strangers. He tightened the pendant at his neck as they entered Pittsburgh, passing the welcome sign, and observed abandoned vehicles lining the shoulders and the road. The scene suggested the mass congestion that had occurred when citizens tried to evacuate the city 20 years earlier when the infection began. Isolated cars now multiplied and pressed together. Where Naruto had seen one car, there were two, then 3 or 4, until the scattered vehicles had become a tide of rusted metal, dust, and rotted tires. Joel slammed on the brakes, forcing the van to stop. Naruto dropped his pendant and Ellie nearly hit the back of the blonde's seat. They had encountered a traffic jam, hundreds of abandoned cars, doors open and poorly parked, blocking their path through the city. They would need another route to get through Pittsburgh while avoiding clusters of infected or the hunters likely operating in the area. Staying put, exposed in the van, was not an option. Naruto considered the possibility that the traffic jam itself could be a trap to hunt outsiders. There was no doubt Pittsburgh harbored scavengers, hunters, and people far more unhinged than the infected. With the main road blocked, Naruto suspected these people would use the situation to ambush anyone arriving in the city. He expected lookouts on the side streets. From inside the van and at that distance, Naruto searched for any sign of an imminent attack. He could see no movement, no birds, no wild animals, no infected nothing. Joel steered the van down the left street, leaving the congestion behind and entering a much narrower area. A leaning lamppost threatened to fall, several vehicles were parked on the sidewalks forcing Joel to keep 2 hands firmly on the wheel, and chunks of concrete made them swerve slightly every few meters. Several cars had been crushed by pieces of building facades from the more dilapidated buildings on the street. The place felt like a prime spot for an ambush. At an intersection, Joel eased off the brake more gently this time, and Ellie leaned forward to see why they had stopped. Joel told them to buckle their seatbelts and pulled the lever to engage something on the van. Ellie protested that it looked like only an injured man. A raggedly dressed man was dragging himself across the road in front of the van, supporting himself with one hand pressed to his left side under a stained bandage. A cap hid greasy hair that fell across his forehead and partly obscured his eyes. He pleaded for help as he crawled. Joel said he did not intend to stop for him and eased the van backward to pass. Naruto, who had moved his hand toward the handgun at his waist, warned that the man was likely a hunter, a scavenger, and that others were probably watching from above. He instructed Ellie to duck. Naruto ordered Ellie to cover herself. Ellie moved from the rear seat and hid behind the front passenger seat, concealing herself so that anyone aiming from a distance would see only Joel and Naruto. Joel acknowledged and put the truck into gear. The vehicle lunged forward and the man who had been pretending to be injured leapt aside to avoid being run over. Someone outside shouted for them to be shot, and gunfire erupted in response. Naruto ducked down while Joel only peeked over the dashboard. Bullets slammed into the truck's body, throwing up sparks where metal struck metal. One shot punctured a front tire and several struck the windshield. Joel turned the wheel hard. The truck crashed through what looked like a storefront, shattering the display window and toppling shelves, and finally came to a stop when Joel braked. The hood and front end were badly damaged and the headlights were destroyed. Joel ordered everyone out. Naruto pushed the passenger door with his shoulder and drew his Glock just as a stranger peered around the wall they had broken through. Naruto fired and the man collapsed, instantly incapacitated on the floor. Lowering his weapon, Naruto scanned the street. No one else appeared to be watching them directly, but sporadic gunfire and shouted voices made it clear the assailants were not far away. They were organizing an assault. Joel grabbed the shotgun from the back and slung on his backpack. He warned that there were more attackers and that they needed to move before they were followed. Naruto noticed a gap in the store's wall that was just large enough for a smaller person. Joel was urging Ellie to squeeze through it. Naruto fetched his own backpack and drew his sword, bow, and quiver of arrows free by force. He told Joel that he would create a diversion and then follow once he had shaken them off and left false trails. Joel looked at Naruto and saw no hesitation, only a resolute determination. Joel handed out modern gas masks from his pack, keeping one and giving the other to Ellie. Naruto gave Ellie a reassuring thumbs up and said he would catch up shortly. Ellie nodded, worried about the plan but unable to dissuade him. Naruto watched Ellie slip through the gap and then saw Joel exit the store, leaving him alone in a heavy, awkward silence. Footsteps and voices shattered the quiet. Assailants called out to check the store and one announced that Mickey was dead. Naruto crouched behind a thick column and heard boots crunching on glass as the attackers entered through the broken display. He felt for his Glock but forced himself to relax his grip. He listened and counted 2 pairs of boots. He could hear one man approaching directly, his breath and hesitant weapon movements betraying nervousness. Naruto shifted to the side and watched the barrel of a shotgun appear. From the other side of the store, the second attacker called out that he couldn't see anything. He swept the shelves and overturned furniture, searching for the intruders who had been in the truck. Suddenly, a chair slammed into the first attacker's knees, destabilizing him and causing his shotgun to fire into a stack of magazines. Using the moment of chaos, Naruto vaulted over a nearby shelf and pinned the man, pressing the shotgun away to prevent further shots. He kept the assailant under control, hands steady on the weapon, leaving no room for insults or threats. When the second attacker tried to react, Naruto moved decisively. He used his knife in a precise, non-graphic strike that quickly incapacitated the man. The attacker went still and did not get back up. Naruto muttered a curse and withdrew his knife, noting the signs of the struggle on the blade. Another sound in the store made Naruto jump and pull back from the fallen man. Several shots tore the floor beside the man's head, leaving 2 smoking holes. One of the assailants ordered Naruto to come out and promised he might live if he did, but Naruto ignored him. The knife flew at the man's throat and silenced him. Naruto vaulted over the counter as another attacker turned to fire. He drove his knee into the man's chest, sending him crashing and knocking him out. Naruto took the man's knife and rested it across his knees, demanding to know how many of them there were. Quick and precise, he pressed the blade under the disoriented companion of the fourth man. The man swore and tried to resist, but Naruto held his ground. Slowly he rose, sheathed the knife, and peered outside. It did not look like a large group, but it could be a patrol controlling outsiders entering Pittsburgh, and his presence might already be known to the others. He cursed under his breath and realized reaching Jackson peacefully was no longer likely. His vacation was over. The room beyond was a ruin. Rubble and dust covered the floor, and several bodies lay scattered against cracked walls and leaning on the pillars that still kept the building standing. There was no sign of active infection among them. Some had been shot, others struck with blunt objects, and some had suffered clean cuts in critical places. Different injuries, different causes of death, they had all died fighting. Spent casings of various sizes glinted among the debris, indicating a mix of firearms had been used. The weapons were not strewn beside their owners. Someone had piled them into a dark metal heap and set it alight. Flames licked at the metal and thick gray smoke rose, clinging to the ceiling before seeping out through the empty window frames and open doors. The smoke made breathing difficult but offered an escape route. If the fire spread further, the building would burn through completely, though no one seemed intent on putting it out. The old side door gave way with a shove. Naruto inhaled a long breath of fresh air, letting it cool his face and ruffle his hair. He ran a hand across his cheek and surveyed the city from the fire escape, neglected and in ruins, with patches of nature reclaiming streets and buildings. Pittsburgh had been taken back by the elements in many places. He picked his way down the rusted stairs, knowing the iron would leave a black stain on his hands. From the last rung he dropped and drew a knife from his belt, crouching behind an old, battered Chevrolet. He peered over the hood and scanned the street. Several infected shuffled between the parked cars, moving erratically with heavy, uncoordinated steps. There were only a few. Naruto eased himself through the cars, keeping to the infected's blind spots. Following them was not like trailing a living human. Their movements were unpredictable and any noise could be fatal. He reminded himself that he had to get to the bridge and find Joel and Ellie, and that meant getting past the infected. He moved with practiced efficiency and neutralized the first one with a precise strike that ended the threat quickly and cleanly. He dragged it aside and used the momentum to put another down before it could react. He leaned against the car and tossed a bottle. When it shattered, the infected moved toward the noise. He knocked an arrow to his bow and held it steady. Before he could draw fully, an explosion erupted nearby, sending flames and debris into the street and incapacitating several infected in a violent blast. Naruto did not linger to see the aftermath. He sprinted. His breath came heavy as he ran, but he kept going, driving forward and taking down another infected with a shot that brought it down instantly. He pushed himself toward higher ground just as a secondary blast went off where he had been fighting. He crouched behind a broken window and scanned the street from cover. The explosions would draw attention not just from the infected, but from any living scavengers in the radius. That had been his plan. The crunch of breaking glass behind him made him turn. Naruto lunged at the door the instant it opened, pushing it hard and knocking down the person on the other side. He pulled his Glock and fired through the rotten wood, splinters flying. Fortunately, it had a silencer. He left the room by stepping over the fallen assailant and continued down the corridor. He needed to get across and either jump out a window or get downstairs. It did not matter which, but he would leave the building one way or another, leaving a trail of incapacitated pursuers. Two men stepped forward to meet him, startled but ready. Naruto did not hesitate. He raised the Glock and fired, hitting one attacker in the shoulder and forcing him to fall back, his dominant arm rendered useless. He barreled into the other like a rugby player, driving him several meters backward onto his back. Naruto had two options: keep running or finish the fallen man. He did not have time to decide before several shots slammed into the wall beside his head. He ducked into another room, slammed the door, and returned fire. He had drawn attention to himself again, which did not bode well and made escaping uninjured unlikely. Naruto ran a hand over his face, sweeping his hair back. He counted the seconds until they would break through the door. He could hear them approaching, gathering and plotting how to stop him or kill him. He suspected the latter. Naruto told himself there was no time. The window was already cleared of glass, but he wiped his left hand, wrapped in a cloth, to remove any remaining shards with methodical care as if there were not men about to break through the door. He turned, gripped the Glock firmly, fired at the door as he vaulted onto the roof. He rolled off and landed on the roof of a truck, feeling his left shoulder ache as if the fall had landed more heavily on that side. He was relieved it was not broken. Without looking back, knowing he would be seen, Naruto sprinted between cars. As he ran, he dropped an empty magazine and replaced it with another, noting the loss of one of his precious magazines. He would have to find it later. He always carried his own magazines, only the bullets changed. One of the pursuing attackers shouted that Naruto should go between the cars. Naruto spun and braked, aimed with narrowed vision, and fired, taking another assailant out of the fight. The pursuers returned fire. Naruto dove behind a van as shots shattered glass and pounded the old, rusted bodywork. The rounds punctured the tires, causing the vehicle to sag and emit a sick metallic creak. Another attacker shouted for cover behind the same van. Naruto drew a deep breath and eased his tension, forcing oxygen into his muscles and clearing his mind to think. Time, however, was the problem. He did not know Joel or Ellie and had no idea which route they had taken to reach the bridge. He only knew they would have to fight for every step to arrive unharmed if they were even alive. Shaking off the dark thought, Naruto reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket he wore as a pendant. He opened it and saw a photograph of a little girl, the daughter of a man he had killed some time ago, the man who had once begged him to return it. Naruto closed the locket tightly. He then drew 2 explosive-tipped arrows from his pack and drove them into the ground, setting a trap. He breathed deeply and ran again, hearing gunfire behind him and sensing the projectiles that chased him. None found their mark. Naruto skidded and fired at his pursuers, vaulting over the hood of an old Ford and using it as momentary cover. Explosions and screams were soon followed by a chain of blasts that turned the stretch of road into a wall of fire. Naruto had gambled that the packed, fuel-stained cars would be vulnerable. He had relied on luck and timing when he planted the explosive arrows. The chain reaction produced several consecutive detonations that engulfed his pursuers in flames and smoke. Naruto did not stop to look back. He would not waste precious seconds to check if they were still in pursuit. He kept his gaze forward, minimizing distractions at his sides and maximizing whatever lay directly ahead. His vision narrowed into a tunnel of focus. His body reacted. He came up on his toes and braked hard, feeling a sting in his heels. An infected lunged for him, aiming for his neck, but missed. Naruto turned and used his knife in a quick, decisive motion to incapacitate it, avoiding graphic harm. He pulled the blade free and flung it at another infected, striking it in the head and rendering it down before landing and snatching the knife by the handle in a practiced motion. Naruto did not know whether the infected felt pain or were aware of their actions, so he could not be gentle while his life was at stake. To him, they were analogous to the attackers chasing him, threats that had to be neutralized. He wiped the knife on his pant leg, stood, and glanced at a sign indicating that the bridge lay about 200 meters ahead. But the distance was still about 200 meters, a stretch full of dangers that could kill him if he let his guard down. He was in the financial district. Naruto put the knife back in its sheath and moved in a crouch, the Glock in his hands with the suppressor attached. He was not as reckless as other survivors and would not shoot openly unless it was part of a plan, and right now that was far from his plan. He edged between cars and took cover behind a scaffold. He raised his head and looked over the edge at the motionless bodies of the hunters. There were enough of them to suggest a firefight had taken place, but no scattered casings to indicate a loud, chaotic exchange. The scene felt like a quiet, careful operation, and Naruto immediately understood that Joel and Ellie were somewhere in the financial district, probably already making their way toward the bridge. Naruto wondered if something was pursuing them, and he noted that a vehicle was following their trail. Using the scaffold for support, Naruto leapt up and crouched behind a stack of pallets, keeping low in case anyone saw him. The area was otherwise clear, only the still bodies lay around, which led him to conclude they had been tracking Joel and Ellie. He studied the vehicle tracks. He was not a car expert, but the tracks showed it was not a normal civilian vehicle. It had greater weight and presence. Naruto muttered that it looked like a DMN military vehicle and sighed in resignation. He wondered if he was going to have to save them from a military vehicle, and whether fate was being cruel. Resigned, Naruto took the ammunition from the dead hunters and stashed it in his backpack. He took an M16 from another body and followed the vehicle's trail. Naruto had no doubt it would lead him to Joel and Ellie. The sun had finally gone below the horizon. The last thin rays faded as night spread like a shroud over Pittsburgh, a dark sky dotted with small, blinking lights and thin clouds where the sun had set, hiding its light. Slowly, the moon rose to take the sun's place, revealing more of its pale, bright surface. Darkness and night favored the infected, especially the clickers, but they were not the only ones moving under the stars and the moon, whose slivers of light fell across everything below. 4 figures had made it to the makeshift iron gates the hunters had set up to prevent their prey from leaving. They stood at the feet of the gate, looking up at the rusted iron and peeling paint. These were not sliding or automatic doors. They were hulking frames of metal, pieces of shipping containers cut and repurposed as gates, set into heavy concrete walls built up over the years. There were mid-level lookout platforms now abandoned, with bodies slumped at the base of the wall. To leave Pittsburgh, the so-called tourists had to cross the bridge, the only viable exit from the city, and contend with whatever threats lay beyond and along the way. The hunters knew this. After driving out Fedra and the military, they had built those walls, manned the lookouts to prevent escapes, and organized rotating night patrols to catch any prey that tried to slip past. They forced anyone attempting to flee to work for their escape, to think hard about how to avoid the hunters and reach the bridge. A frontal assault on the bridge would cost blood, lives, and ammunition the fugitives could ill afford. Despite that, Joel had decided to take the front of the bridge, which meant confronting the guards posted to defend the entrance. Joel and Henry, however, had opened fire on the lookouts and taken the front much more easily than the hunters had expected. Henry and his younger brother Sam had joined Joel and Ellie recently while they searched for a way out of Pittsburgh. Both pairs had formed a temporary alliance to evade the hunters, the Humvee that had been following them, and the infected lurking in the dark corners of the city. The 2 brothers had fled their quarantine zone and were searching for a new home with companions from Hartford. They had been ambushed by hunters when they entered Pittsburgh to scavenge supplies, forcing them to separate and arrange a rendezvous point outside the city, away from the hunters, so they could continue their journey. That was the story Henry, the older brother, told Joel to convince him of the temporary alliance. Joel had been wary at first about trusting strangers. He worried they might be leading them into a trap or that they might be hunters in disguise. He had already lost Naruto when Joel chose to leave him behind to protect Ellie, a decision that had later felt like a mistake. If Naruto had been with them, Joel would not fear Henry or his companions as much. He was now at the bridge. Naruto was not with them. Joel assumed the worst despite Naruto's uncanny ability to survive. He could not afford to stop. A light touch from Ellie pulled Joel out of his reverie. He cleared his throat, pressed the bridge rail under his fingers, and then took 2 long strides to the improvised gate, heaving at the edge with all his strength. The gate, a massive slab of rusted metal, weighed dozens of kilos. Compounded by the pressure of the surrounding concrete, it made opening the gate difficult. It was no rotten plank or cheap sheet, it was a chunk of container steel repurposed as a blockade. Joel and Henry set their feet and bent their knees, bracing to force the gate open. They eased the doors open just enough to breathe and, pulling from both sides, produced a loud screech that could have been heard for hundreds of meters, alerting infected and humans alike. But they had done it. The doors were open and, beyond them, a short path led to a second door much like the one they had just forced. Once they crossed the first threshold, they would be out of the hunter's sight and away from the infected behind them. At that moment, a spotlight flared on the right side of the street and bathed it in light. Before the beam, the sound of tires on asphalt grew louder until the source revealed itself, the hunter's Humvee. Joel hauled Ellie back and Henry did the same with Sam. Both adults slammed the first door shut and bolted it, blocking the Humvee's path. They knew that would not hold long. The Humvee would ram the doors, likely sending them crashing down with one forceful blow. Joel expected the vehicle's occupants to step out, check the barricade, and push it aside. A hunter from the Humvee shouted that they had found them. The shot that followed silenced whoever had called from the other side of the street. Ellie, Sam, and Henry looked to Joel. Joel had fired at a man standing atop a truck and killed him with a single, precise shot to the head. Joel told them to move. He tucked the revolver into the back of his worn jeans and ran toward the truck. The top of a folding ladder was still hooked to the edge of the truck's roof, tilted slightly, but not long enough to reach the ground. Joel bent his knees, cupped his hands and made a makeshift step. Henry understood without being told. He stepped his right foot onto Joel's hands and, when Joel lifted him, used the short ladder as a boost to reach the truck's edge. He caught the roof with his fingers and pulled himself up. Joel urged Henry on. The next to climb was Sam, Henry's little brother. Sam was lighter and swung up easily. Henry grabbed him and hauled him to the roof. Joel urged them to hurry. Their time to clear the truck and reach the second door was limited. The Humvee's lights shrank as its driver backed up to try another ram. Ellie didn't wait for instruction. She leapt and used Joel's hands as a step. Henry caught her with his left hand and pulled her up beside his brother. Gunfire cracked, making Henry and Sam flinch, but Ellie remained steady. She looked toward the door just as another burst of shots rang out and called for Henry to help her. Henry began to shake his head and take a few steps back. He said they were leaving and urged Sam to go. Ellie turned toward him and protested that he couldn't abandon her. Henry insisted he could and told Sam to run. The two brothers ran across the truck, jumped toward the cab, and, swallowed by the dark, disappeared from Ellie's sight. The first door finally gave way, catching Joel and Ellie by surprise. The Humvee slid into view and its spotlight pinned them, forcing both to squint. They were trapped. Joel briefly looked at Ellie. If she ran after Henry and Sam, she might get away and be under their protection, but he would likely die. Joel thought that at least Ellie would be safe. Suddenly the Humvee's spotlight shattered in a flash of sparks. The hunter man manning the vehicle-mounted machine gun was startled and dropped back from the turret, nearly falling. An unseen projectile struck the hunter who had been on the turret, hitting his neck. He crumpled, incapacitated and unable to reach the gun. All four doors of the Humvee opened. Joel could not wait. He drew the revolver and fired at the passenger side door, hitting a man as he emerged and putting him down almost immediately. Another projectile struck the driver in the side. In the faint glow of nearby fires and the moon, Ellie made out the weapon that had struck him, a long wooden arrow with dark feathers at the end. Ellie called out the name Naruto. Joel reacted by firing at another man who was stepping out, and at the same moment another arrow struck the last hunter, knocking him sideways into the rear seat of the Humvee. A figure dropped from a window of the building to Joel and Ellie's right, landing hard but without finesse. His face and hair were in plain view. The young man announced that he had tracked their trail through the financial district, referring to both them and the hunters. Joel asked if he had been the one who caused the explosions they had heard after leaving the hunters. Naruto admitted that he had used explosive arrows to deal with infected and hunters pursuing him. He explained that he had created a diversion to make the two groups fight, then picked up their trail again, though following them here had not been easy. Naruto had the practiced look of someone used to tracking and pursuing targets, though Pittsburgh had proven to be a difficult stretch for him. The infected lurked around every corner and hunters appeared at every intersection, searching for the tourists who had broken away from their companions and ran through the city as if it belonged to them. Naruto did not doubt that the tourists were Joel and Ellie, as well as himself. Naruto said that he was glad Joel was not dead. Joel replied that he felt the same. The boy slung his bow over his shoulder and Joel returned to his previous stance. Naruto leaned against Joel and pushed himself upward. With Ellie's help he managed to make a simple leap onto the truck roof. Naruto told Joel that it was his turn. Joel stepped back, ran toward the truck, and jumped just before colliding with the container wall. Naruto reached out, took Joel's hand, and pulled him up beside them. Naruto admitted that more hunters would probably come and that they would likely take the Humvee if it was left. He suggested they head across the bridge before more of those men pursued them. Joel nodded. The three ran over the truck and dropped down in a single bound, leaving behind the closed door, the empty Humvee, and several bodies that would alert others. They did not look back. They only ran forward, weaving around abandoned cars and small barricades. They were likely following a path similar to Henry and his brother Sam, but that did not matter now. Joel stopped first, followed by Ellie and then Naruto. Naruto pointed out a huge gap in the roadway they could not bypass and told them they had to jump directly to the river. Backtracking would take them straight back into Pittsburgh, into hunters and infected. Ellie confessed that she could not swim. Naruto said he would go behind her, slung his bow over his shoulder again, and urged her not to be afraid and to jump. Joel jumped first without hesitation. Ellie followed, trembling, and admitted she hated cold water. Naruto jumped after her. The water was dark and rough from the storm, constantly slamming against the hulls of abandoned boats that had rotted from years without maintenance since the infection began. The lights of Pittsburgh and the bridge had faded into the distance and survived only in memory. Small lights still moved along the structure as if searching the water. Far from the bridge and the city, something broke the river's surface. A figure burst up near the shore, coughing and moving with difficulty. His backpack hung from only his right shoulder and was almost destroyed, far emptier than when he had entered the city. Naruto stopped when he reached the bank, braced himself on his legs, and coughed hard, bringing up the water that had rushed into his mouth. His hair was soaked, plastered to his forehead, without the usual rebellious blonde tufts. After catching his breath, he raised his head and searched for Joel and Ellie. They had jumped from at least 20 meters straight into the water, with no protection or flotation. Ellie had jumped out of necessity. Naruto, if he was honest, feared the water even more. What could hide beneath so many liters of dark, moving water without a single ray of light? The infected might be present and hiding below the surface. The world had gone to ruin because of a parasite, and to him everything now seemed possible. Soaked as he was, Naruto walked to a broken wooden boat and leaned against it. He dropped the backpack and took off his green jacket, leaving only the sleeveless shirt on his torso. Dumping the pack scattered its contents across the ground. His spare clothes were drenched and no better than the ones he wore. The remaining explosive arrows were useless, no better than ordinary arrows. He had been lucky that the bullets in his gun had not gotten wet and that the powder had survived. He still had his katana and his combat knife, which was a relief, though he knew a sword and a knife would not be enough. Against a whole horde. His bow was snapped in two, useless, and he could not build another on the spot. Returning to Pittsburgh was not an option for now. He had no doubt the hunters would be on high alert and far more brutal toward intruders after what had happened when they fled the city. They had probably gone completely savage. Naruto thought bitterly about the hunters. He checked his body carefully, feeling both sides of his ribs, his chest, and his stomach for wounds. He examined his legs and took off his boots to inspect his feet. He scanned every part of his skin before dressing again, even if it meant wearing sodden clothing. He found no wound. A relieved sigh escaped him as he buckled his belt, hearing the satisfying click when the two ends met. He adjusted the holster at his thigh and slid his pistol into place, feeling the weapon's weight tug his pants slightly downward. His jacket, pants, and undershirt bore tears from being slammed against rocks by the current. He had been fortunate not to have been crushed or drowned. Naruto crouched and gathered what was salvageable from the backpack. He tested the compass and tucked it into his left pocket. He looped the only gas mask he had onto the left side of his belt, feeling it thump against his thigh when he reached for the katana and slung the sword across his back. He took the protein bars and the jerky, gathered the last of the magazines and the flashlight that lay a few meters from the torn backpack beside a drenched map of the United States. He collected everything that might be useful and stood, hearing angry shouts not far away. Naruto recognized Joel's voice. He had heard it before when Bill and Joel argued about what to do with him. As he listened more carefully, he caught another male voice, less deep and not a child's. He wondered whether they were arguing with someone else and whether Ellie might be in danger. Naruto rested his hand on the pistol's grip and moved toward the sound, circling the ruined wooden boat. There were 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children. He immediately recognized 2 of them. The other 2 were unfamiliar. He quickly understood that the boys were brothers and that they had crossed paths with Joel and Ellie when he had not been with them. From a few meters away he watched the older boy, who gestured and looked embarrassed, as if he had done something Joel could criticize. Naruto wondered what it might be. Perhaps they had tried to take supplies while Joel and Ellie were incapacitated after the river. He could not hear the end of the argument. The conversation snapped off as he approached with his right hand on his pistol. The older boy's nerves showed. He trained his gun on Naruto, and Naruto halted, brow raising in a measured gesture. Ellie stepped between them, placing herself between Naruto and the pointed weapon. Naruto acknowledged her action with quiet gratitude but kept his hand on his own pistol and his eyes fixed on the older brother. Ellie declared that the man with them was their companion, and Naruto saw Joel reach toward his own revolver, perplexity clouding the older brother's face as he glanced between them and then at his younger brother, who cowered a little and clung to the fabric of his pants. Naruto intervened and moved his hand away from his pistol to ease the tension. He then asked who they were and noted that they were from Pittsburgh, since he had come with Joel and the others all the way here. Ellie pointed out the older brother as Henry and the smaller one as Sam, explaining that Joel and she had met them in the city while hiding from hunters and that they had helped each other survive. Naruto cut in and asked Henry directly whether he had left Joel and Ellie to protect his brother. Henry's dark eyes flashed with guilt. He looked away, embarrassed by whatever had happened. Naruto's blue eyes shifted to little Sam, who sank closer behind his brother, clearly frightened by the confrontation and by the guns in the adult's hands. Naruto did not trust appearances. He had seen children capable of violent survival before, and he himself had done what he had to when his settlement fell. The present world demanded survival over trust. Sensing the moment, Ellie gripped Naruto's wrist. He blinked at the warmth of her fingers, a brief, gentle touch that steadied him. She asked if he was all right. Naruto murmured that he disliked the river and water, and took a step back. It was a small untruth, but it matched the calm expression he offered the brothers. Joel watched him with the wary assessment of someone who had survived hard years and made difficult choices. Naruto reflected on Joel as an example of a true survivor, a man forced into choices no one should have to make when civilization fell apart. It earned Naruto's respect. Henry snapped that of course he had done it to protect his brother, his voice hard with resolve. The guilt vanished and was replaced by a steely determination. Naruto could read from Henry's eyes that he would fight fiercely for his sibling. Henry's posture and dark gaze made that clear without further proof. Naruto slowly lowered his hand from his gun and offered a conciliatory smile, suggesting they all calm down. Henry relaxed and slipped his pistol back into the waistband of his pants, nodding to acknowledge Naruto's words. The tension eased and Joel visibly loosened his stance. Naruto offered his name and Henry returned the greeting. Naruto then asked where they were headed. Joel answered that they were going to the radio tower to see if they could find Tommy or Henry's companions there. Naruto nodded, though he doubted anyone still remained at the tower. Hunters and the wandering infected had likely taken their toll. Still, the possibility that someone might be there held a sliver of hope. The odds were too slim, so Naruto did not have high expectations. He admitted with a tired smile that he needed to dry off and that he would accompany them to see who was there. The watchtower was empty, but there were signs that people had been there before. Crumpled containers, a water bottle with a dark liquid inside, crushed cigarettes at the entrance, a cot in one room and a bed in another. A map hung on the wall above a battered, rusted refrigerator that no longer made steady noises. On a table facing an old, worn sofa sat an aged communications set, its components dust-covered and threaded with cobwebs, producing faint, intermittent sounds as if someone had tried to contact the place. But there was no one to answer. Neither Tommy nor Henry and Sam's companions were present when the five of them burst into the building, slightly out of breath from running up to the tower. They took a general look around, checking each room, but the place had clearly been abandoned for days or weeks at least, dashing Joel's hopes of finding his brother there. Naruto walked to the communications set and dropped his battered, still damp backpack on the abandoned sofa. He pulled a chair close, sat down, and brushed dust with his forearm, not caring that cobwebs, dust, and small insects clung to him. His attention fixed on the equipment, which gave off faint, discordant blinking lights, one fading, another coming on. It was not proof that it worked, but Naruto took it as an indication that it might. He stretched his arms and cracked his knuckles. Behind him, Joel and Ellie were putting their things away, searching for supplies and settling in alongside Henry and Sam to spend the night. A night without being pursued, without hunters or infected. It felt unreal, but for a few hours they might be safe. Naruto placed both hands on the table and felt the splintered, slightly rotten wood give with a soft creak under his pressure. It seemed fragile enough to collapse, taking the radio with it, so he decided not to test it further. He examined the set instead. It was an old radio system that could communicate with other devices on the same frequency over a moderate range, perhaps a kilometer or so. Beyond that distance, the signal would cut out abruptly, but it was enough to coordinate with nearby allies during patrols. Surely the Fireflies had used the tower when they were in the area, before the military drove them out. Naruto noted that it was an old outpost, certainly abandoned and no longer part of the Fireflies' plans. Covered in dust and cobwebs like a thin shroud, the communications equipment showed that no one had treated the site as useful for some time. They were safe from someone claiming it that night, but they still needed to keep searching for Joel's brother. Naruto thought it would be best to continue in the morning. He stood and cut the cables, rendering the set unusable. They did not need it. They were all together in the same room. But someone could use it against them to call for a group to hunt them down, and he could not risk that. He left it beyond functional repair, still reparable by someone skilled with electricity, but not immediately usable. He picked up his torn backpack and left his things scattered on the sofa. While Sam and Ellie played, Naruto moved through the room hunting for another pack. His own would not last much longer. One of the straps had come loose and the stitching had split. He needed a replacement, though they were difficult to find. It would be a small task to learn what was left in the place. The watchtower had become, or rather had been turned into, a livable stop for any patrol or survivor team. A large common room held a round wooden table flanked by two slightly wobbly chairs. To the right was the room where Ellie and Henry were, and to the left, at the other end, sat the communications gear and the old sofa. In a small kitchen to the left was the refrigerator Naruto had noticed on entering, silent, rusty, and broken down. Aside from a shabby cot by the radio table, there was little else. Trash lay scattered across the room, and Joel had started bagging it up with Henry's help, while Henry watched him constantly with cautious eyes. Naruto understood the feeling. He felt wary of Henry and stayed alert to the younger man's movements. Even if someone traveled with a younger brother, Naruto doubted the world had kept them sane. He had never been fully the same after what he had gone through. The intrusive thought made him stop and lean against the kitchen doorway. He closed his eyes forcefully and took a deep, steadying breath, letting the air fill his lungs and renew him for a few seconds. He fumbled for the Firefly's locket and looked again at the photo of a girl who resembled Ellie in hair and eye color but not in face. Seeing that face brought back memories of a red-haired man who had died, how Naruto had been forced to stop him before he could become one of the infected. It had been months since he had dwelt on that memory, though it still lingered. That was his locket, the one he had to deliver to Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, along with a note that read problematic. Naruto tucked the locket beneath his sleeveless shirt and steadied himself, pushing up with his hands and using the doorframe for support. Joel had noticed Naruto's faintness, how he had nearly fallen after the stumble. He watched him brace against the frame and saw the strange look Naruto gave the locket before slipping it away and rising with a determined shove. Worry creased Joel's features. He took Naruto by the shoulder and asked if he was tired or sick, suggesting that the river had been harsh and that Naruto might have caught a chill after being so wet. Naruto shook his head and allowed Joel to guide him to the couch, insisting that he did not get sick and that, as far as he remembered, he had not been ill in 17 years. Henry had cleared the furniture and placed the items beside a backpack on a chair. Joel urged Naruto to rest and warned that Pittsburgh could wear anyone down. He said he would look for medicine. Naruto said nothing, closed his eyes, and tilted his head back. He did not feel ill, only overwhelmingly exhausted, without the energy to take another step. He could not remember the last time he had slept an entire day. Since leaving home, he had been wandering to survive. Sleep had become secondary to finding food and fighting off infected pursuers. Survival had been his life. Scavenging, running, shooting. Had his body finally reached its limit? Was this a warning to stop moving and rest at last? Ellie, who had been playing with Sam, heard the commotion and Joel's voice and came into the room with Sam following. She saw Naruto sink onto the couch, supported by Joel and Henry. Ellie asked what was wrong. Joel explained that Naruto was tired and asked if he had been bitten. Naruto shook his head and remained calm, reluctant to disturb the small, peaceful moment. He said he would know if he had been bitten, that a bite would be felt and visible, and assured them he was far from infected. Joel nodded and returned to the round table, leaving the three younger children on the couch. Sam sat at the left end while Ellie curled up on the right. Henry's little brother played with a doll, and the sight made Naruto smile, a warmth spreading through his chest. Ellie asked again if he was sure he was all right. Naruto met her eyes and assured her he was fine, attributing his state to accumulated exhaustion and explaining that he had not slept well in months. He was not lying. Months had passed without proper rest, without even sitting to close his eyes. That simple act had caused his body to stop for lack of fuel. His head felt foggy and his eyes could barely focus on a single point, drifting between Ellie, Henry and his toy, and the communications equipment. He tried to keep himself centered. He did not feel sleepy so much as disconnected, his mind bringing forth fragmented memories like a light drizzle in his head. It was strangely calming, though he felt vulnerable. Ellie broke the silence and asked where he was from, noting that his name did not seem local and that, with his blonde hair and blue eyes, he did not fit her expectations of someone from his heritage. Naruto laughed softly and genuinely, surprised by how long it had been since he had heard his own laugh. He admitted he was Asian, his mother was Japanese and his father was too, though his paternal grandparents had American roots. He thought he had inherited those features from his family. His voice had tightened when he mentioned his parents. Ellie read the tension and quietly suspected they might be dead or turned, a likely reality in their world. She rose softly and led Sam away to give Naruto space to rest. Joel returned with a metal cup that gave off steam. Naruto leaned forward with effort, hands on his knees, and accepted the cup with a grateful smile. Henry brought another cup as well. Joel mentioned that it was coffee. Naruto inhaled the aroma. Coffee was rare now, and only the older people remembered having a cup. 20 years had passed since the infection began, and anyone born after that had likely never tasted it. Naruto said his parents had kept a supply of coffee and tea and had worked hard to maintain them for their colony, so he was used to the taste and missed it. Henry's eyes were on the katana. The scabbard and blade bore no adornments, but the weapon radiated a quiet strength that Henry could sense. He asked who had taught Naruto to use the sword. Naruto answered that his mother had taught him. She had been a fencer, a true swordswoman. Naruto explained that his grandfather had been a swordsmith and a master swordsman who had taught his mother. He reached out and took the sword gently from Henry's hands, which had been resting on the chair. Naruto said the sword belonged to his family and likely dated from the feudal era. He explained that the Uzumaki had once been a clan of warriors who served the emperor, and that his grandfather had given them this nameless sword without the mark of a mastersmith. He only knew that it had not been forged by his ancestors. Naruto closed his hand around the hilt and pulled the blade free, revealing a dark gray edge about 75 centimeters long from guard to tip. There were no stains on the blade. Naruto had always kept it clean and ready, another habit his mother had instilled in him. Joel admitted that he did not know much about swords but allowed that it looked beautiful. Naruto said it was indeed a fine piece and speculated that, before society collapsed, it might have been worth a great deal. He added that if the stories his mother told were true, the sword could be 5 centuries old, though the past was hard to verify. A click sounded as Naruto sheathed the sword. Henry murmured that he would have liked to meet Naruto's grandfather, lamenting how the elder's stories had been lost. Naruto placed the sword back slowly and said that he had to live with the memories his mother had given him. He acknowledged the pain but insisted he was not regretful. He continued because of his family. Joel shook his head and urged them to leave the sad topics. He asked whether Naruto felt better after taking caffeine. Naruto explained that caffeine did not affect him much but that it had given him a little energy. He suggested that sitting still after months on the move was probably what had pushed his body to its limit and apologized for frightening Joel. Joel said he was glad Naruto was better and added with a dry remark that the fact Naruto had not been bitten spared him from shooting that arrogant smile. Naruto laughed and denied having an arrogant smile. Joel raised his right eyebrow and said he doubted it. Henry, who had not known Naruto long, commented that among the trio Joel and Ellie were the ones he had known best during their time in Pittsburgh and escaping hunters and the infected. Joel described Naruto as charming at first glance but also arrogant, someone who trusted his abilities above much else. He testified that Naruto had fought through infected to get them out of Lincoln without wounds, had defended them against hunters and infected in Pittsburgh, and had managed to find them again in the end. Joel observed that perhaps it was less arrogance than an excessive faith in his own skills. Naruto mumbled that those were merely survival skills he had learned. He said his mother had taught him much, and the rest had come from surviving on the streets, fighting in a corrupt world and facing the infected. He finished his coffee and reflected that from then on he had kept growing, learning and absorbing everything he could, becoming better. He admitted he had rarely had the chance to rest or feel secure. Resting now was a luxury. He stopped talking and sighed, the conversation having opened up some of the feelings he had kept inside. Joel remarked that Naruto's mother had been a great woman. Naruto agreed and said he intended to honor everything she had taught him. A sudden scream shattered the quiet. Joel and Henry moved first. Naruto was slower, pushed by fatigue his mind had not yet acknowledged. Ellie came running from the doorway and threw herself at Naruto. He caught her, wrapping an arm around her waist and drawing her behind him. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, making Naruto look toward the open door. Henry's voice identified who it was: Sam. Naruto thought about how, in the aftermath of deaths, bodies were often left where they fell, left to the elements and forgotten. But when someone you knew died, you could not simply abandon them. He had buried his older sister, his mother, and his father. They had been people close to him. Even though he had not known Henry and Sam well, he had not hesitated to bury them. His conscience would not allow him to leave them, and he found himself holding the frightened Ellie, who clung to him after Sam's sudden changes. Sam had been one of the only boys near her age besides Naruto. The hardest part, Naruto reflected, had been watching Henry's despair and his reaction to what had happened. It was a normal response to the horror of seeing a loved one transformed into one of the infected. Naruto could not judge him. Who could bear such a thing and simply go on? He sank the shovel into the ground once more and left it standing at the head of Henry's grave. He stared at it with sorrow, his hands gripping the handle tightly, nails whitening against the worn wood. He remembered a similar moment 7 years earlier when the shovel had felt impossibly heavy, when lifting it only a few centimeters had required him to stagger as the packed earth acted as a counterweight. For Henry, Naruto had used the old refrigerator as a makeshift container, covering him with a blanket and sealing it closed with tape so the resting place would remain undisturbed. For little Sam, Naruto had built a small coffin and wrapped his body in another blanket, trimming the cloth with the blade of his katana so he could use it to cover the child completely, leaving nothing exposed to the elements. The bodies would be claimed by the earth. Naruto left the shovel, set 2 crosses, one at each grave, and walked away. He did not know Henry or little Sam well enough to write an epitaph on those makeshift markers. He could, however, tell that Henry had been protective, willing and brave by the way he had put his brother before Joel, Ellie, and even himself. He could also tell that Sam had been a charming, curious child who adored his older brother above all else. Both brothers had been too good for a world that kept changing, a world full of horrors, people who looked human but were monsters, and betrayals that could end lives. Naruto himself did not know how he had survived, after 7 years focused solely on staying alive. Perhaps Henry had been the kind who never lost hope, who refused to sink into darkness so long as Sam was safe. Sam had been his light, his center, the thing Henry clung to until he finally let go and dragged them both into the void. Thinking of Henry and Sam as he walked back with Joel and Ellie made Naruto remember his older sister, his mother and his father. All 3 had died long ago, his sister the most recent. Mito had been the last of his family alive, the last to hold him before she left. It was not a choice she had made lightly. They had promised to stay together after their parents, and David had taken her from them. Naruto squeezed his eyes shut, holding back tears, and whispered an apology to his sister, admitting he could not save her. He glanced over his shoulder toward the shallow graves. The brothers had reminded him of himself and Mito. They had once traveled the country searching for a new home until they joined David's group. David had seemed kind, but it was a mask built to lure them into a trap. Like a spider, David ensnared them in his web and restricted their lives. It had been suffocating, but it had been the only place they could live and hide from the infected, the military, and the dangerous people who walked the world, though danger had been all around them even then. The past bore down on him like a weight. Naruto's steps felt heavy, air struggled to reach his lungs, and his vision clouded with memories he kept locked inside. Faces of his sister and parents flickered with every step as if he were watching a film. He also saw David's face, then the face of the man he had faced before reaching Boston, and the promise he had made after that. Joel asked if Naruto was sure he could keep going. Joel had noticed Naruto's skin had paled and his eyes had a glassy look, as if he were not fully present. He worried the boy might be sick, running a fever, or even bitten by an infected. If that were the case, symptoms should have shown hours earlier. Naruto stopped. He told them not to worry, fished some thread from a torn shirt, and used it to repair the strap of his backpack so he could sling it fully on his back. He said they could not afford to fall behind and reminded Joel that Jackson was not nearby. They had to find Joel's brother and locate the Fireflies. Ellie pulled at Naruto's sleeve and warned that his health was more important, telling him he looked awful. Naruto muttered that he was merely tired and told them not to fuss, adding that if they kept talking it would grow dark. He pushed off and resumed walking. Joel sighed and nudged Ellie to get moving. Ellie frowned but fell into place behind Joel and behind Naruto, watching him constantly with growing concern. Since the previous night after the graves, Naruto had been erratic, clumsy, and exhausted in a way that did not sit right with her. Joel did not stop the boy, so she kept a close eye on him. They had nearly a month of travel ahead. Jackson County, where Tommy lived, was in Wyoming, roughly 2,575 kilometers from Pittsburgh. They no longer had a car, so they would walk. They would move through forests and along roads, fight through undergrowth, potholes, and varied terrain. No one believed they would avoid the infected. Some would surely be hiding in woods, on back roads, or in abandoned cars at the roadside. The journey would be dangerous, with little chance to turn back once it started. Determined to reach Jackson, Naruto took the lead as guide, scout, and lookout, bow in hand. After hours on the move, Joel positioned himself at the rear with his pistol ready and left Ellie in the middle, her revolver secured in her pack. Joel could not understand why he allowed Naruto to go first when he was the adult. A 17-year-old was shouldering responsibility, protecting them, and willing to risk his life as their scout. Joel found himself relying on a young man when he should have been the one stepping forward. But Naruto was stubborn and persistent. 3 days into the journey, they paused. Naruto told Joel to stop worrying and insisted he could carry them, that he had experience in tracking and scouting. He pointed out that he had managed to survive in Pittsburgh without being bitten. Naruto insisted that the journey would be a little harder because they had nearly a month to travel and that he would take responsibility for protecting them. Since the deaths of Henry and Sam, something had changed in Naruto. Joel noticed it. The tone with which Naruto declared he would protect them carried regret. Not for protecting them, but for something he had failed to do. Joel no longer worried only about the boy's pale face. He was concerned about Naruto's insistence on being the one to bring them to Tommy, as if it were a duty he could not abandon. On the 10th day of the trip, Joel muttered that Naruto was overexerting himself and warned that if he kept pushing like this he would end up sick, even though he rarely got ill. Naruto responded quietly. Joel then asked Ellie to help gather firewood and ordered Naruto to rest in the sleeping bag. He told himself he should not let a boy take charge while he was unwell. Joel pushed Naruto into the sleeping bag and left him there, tucked in. Autumn had arrived with heavy, steady rains, and the bad weather did nothing to help anyone who felt unwell. Joel watched Naruto burrow under the canvas, pull it up over his head, and close his eyes. Ellie broke the silence after the fire was lit and they were sheltered in an old gas station. Naruto was breathing softly. They could see the sleeping bag rising and falling with his breaths. Ellie said that something had changed in Naruto. Joel sighed, swirling a sip of water, and suggested that whatever had affected Naruto after leaving the graves might be repressed trauma. He admitted he was no expert but observed that Naruto's overexertion looked like an attempt to avoid something that had happened, something connected to people. Joel made it clear to Ellie that she should not mention any speculations aloud. He warned that they could be getting themselves into trouble if they were careless. Ellie confirmed that she had been watching Naruto. Joel replied that it had been unnecessary to watch too closely. The trio resumed travel at dawn the next day, leaving the gas station and using what supplies they had salvaged. They were closer to Jackson according to a dusty map they had found under a stack of oil cans. Naruto produced an old compass that had belonged to his father and used it, along with lessons about moss on trees, stars, the moon, and the sun, to guide them west toward Jackson. On the way they encountered skirmishes with infected and with bandits who wanted their supplies. The clashes unfolded like swift, choreographed encounters. Naruto tried to incapacitate the bandits, recognizing their desperation, but treated the infected as an immediate lethal threat and acted to keep them all alive. Joel and Ellie shared the same resolve: survival mattered. Naruto led the final climb, using every ounce of strength he had on a slope strewn with uneven, treacherous steps. Joel and Ellie followed, and when they crested the hill they saw the dam below, the North Teton Dam that supplied Jackson. Tommy's community was nearby. Naruto fingered the locket under his shirt and remembered the face of a girl. She resembled Ellie in hair and eyes, and if his father had been right, that similarity meant they might have been mistaken about something important. Joel started down toward the entrance and told them to look for his brother. Naruto slipped the locket away and followed Ellie, who moved cautiously behind Joel, taking small, careful steps to avoid falling. Joel offered to help her. When Naruto took her by the waist to carry her the last distance, Joel told them to stop horsing around like children. Naruto set Ellie down near the gate and she playfully punched him in the shoulder. Joel scolded them both. As Joel touched the chain-link fence and looked for a gap, the group felt eyes on them. In the next instant a number of rifles were raised. A woman moved through the line of armed people and made it clear she would not allow them to force their way in. The woman was blonde, with gray eyes and hair pulled back. Dirt and the marks of hard work showed on her face. The group lowered their weapons at her command without objection. One man had pointed a shotgun directly at Naruto, freezing him in place. Then another of the armed men lowered his weapon and recognized Joel. The man called out Joel's name. Joel blinked and then smiled when he realized who it was. The man was Tommy. The brothers embraced after years apart. They had found Jackson and they had found Tommy. The North Teton Dam and power plant were in good condition and served as the county's power source. Tommy welcomed them inside and introduced them to Maria, his wife and the leader of the community. Naruto observed that Maria commanded the respect and obedience of the people. Orders were followed without argument, and the confrontation at the gate had been defused because of her authority. Naruto had come close to retaliating against the man who had aimed at him, and had that happened it could have sparked a larger conflict. He felt grateful that tempers had been kept in check. The newcomers saw how much work the Jackson community had put into the dam and the power plant. The residents had built walls, repaired fences, and placed doors wherever needed to protect the facility from raiders and the infected. They had created something like a town in a ruined world, and Naruto admired the scale and determination of the effort. Not, at least, in the real world, although Naruto doubted they were. He allowed himself a small hope, no more than a spark. Maria and Tommy gave the trio a tour of the plant, introducing them to some of the men and women who worked there and explaining how they had built the community. There were no idle people wandering or sleeping on the job. Even the youngest were working, laying bricks, checking machinery, and keeping watch from the towers. After the initial tour, the couple led the group to Maria's office for a private conversation. Tommy needed to know how his brother had been. The Miller brothers had not seen each other for years after a rift between them, a subject neither wanted to rehash because of the deep affection still there and the long time apart. At first, Naruto noticed a faint resentment between the brothers, enough to think a disagreement had occurred. Maybe it had been about the time Tommy had spent with the Fireflies, or something else. Naruto did not pry when that look passed and warmth returned to their faces without words. The affection between them remained intact. Maria handed Naruto a cup and explained that this would help, mentioning that Joel had said he had been tired and that she wanted to learn a little about him while they talked. She added that Tommy would learn about him from Joel. Naruto accepted the cup with a small grateful nod, then immediately coughed and spat a little, discovering the brew was stronger than expected. Naruto laughed and explained that he had joined Joel and Ellie to find the Fireflies, acknowledging that he presented himself as a member of that group as a cover. He clarified that the label was a mask he had kept since meeting Joel and Ellie and that abandoning it now made no sense. He said his companions had not told Henry and Sam about the cover, and that revealing his true mission to everyone was not an option. Maria asked whether the girl felt some affection for him and whether he saw Joel and Ellie only as a means to reach Marlene. She watched him closely, emotion restrained but attentive. Naruto admitted that at first he had seen them as a path to his goal, but then he continued out of his own choice. He said his aim now was not Marlene but to prevent harm from coming to Ellie and Joel. He did not want them to die when they had treated him well. Maria nodded but remained quiet for a moment. Naruto took another large sip from the cup, leaving only a stain at the bottom. She commented that he seemed sincere but that she suspected he was looking for something beyond simply protecting them. Maria said she had noticed him more closely after Ellie had appeared worried by his distance. She trusted Joel and the girl, she said, but Naruto's pallor and lack of coordination when he arrived made her concerned. Naruto explained that Joel and Ellie worried about him excessively and that he did not need more people fussing over him. He insisted that he was simply tired and that a few days of good sleep when this was over would make him feel better. Maria crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, holding an analytical gaze on the young man. She did not believe he was well. His face was pale and his eyes glassy, and he moved with a nervous stiffness as if he did not want to be examined. She felt responsible and thought he needed a doctor. Maria said she would call the doctor. Naruto refused and expressed gratitude for her concern, insisting again that he was fine and only needed rest without thinking about infected or bandits. Naruto knew he would not convince Maria the way he had convinced Joel and Ellie. She was stubborn and determined to make sure he rested even against his will. He appreciated the worry, but he insisted he could take care of himself as he had for the last 7 years. He reminded himself that he had not fallen ill during all that time and did not intend this to be the first occasion. He instinctively touched the locket. Maria noticed the gesture and offered him a small, appraising look before returning her attention to the room. His blue eyes shone with renewed intensity and his face looked a little less pale, with a touch more color than a moment before. Maria sighed, exasperated by the boy's juvenile behavior, and stepped away from the small table where she had been leaning. She disliked hormones and the way young people thought themselves invincible. She did not know Naruto well enough to tell if he was lying or to force him to rest. Maria walked to the door, opened it, and said that she would give him some medication before calling for Eric to bring the first aid kit. Medication was precious and not to be wasted. Naruto tried to stand, but Maria pushed him back into the chair and leaned against the table, watching him closely. Maria made it clear that she would ensure he recovered or regained some strength and that she would not let him leave without medicines that could help. She gave him a choice. He could go with Joel and Ellie with medication, or be separated from them and stay with the community until he recovered. Naruto laughed dryly and nodded firmly, thinking it better to follow Joel and Ellie with the medicine than be separated and lose Marlene. He promised that Joel would make sure he took it. Maria warned him that she was taking his word and hoped he would not break his promise. The thought that Uzumaki never broke promises echoed in Naruto's memory and sent a chill through him, though Maria could not see it. The phrase stirred him as if a memory brushed past. Naruto swallowed hard and accepted the responsibility of his words, reiterating that he would take the medication and would not break his promise. Maria studied him, searching for any sign of deceit in his eyes or manner, waiting for a tell. Naruto remained still, not even blinking or changing expression. Eric, a large man with broad shoulders, huge arms, and a lumberjack beard, handed Maria the first aid kit. Maria thanked him. Eric nodded slowly, glanced at Naruto with small dark eyes, and left the room. Once the door closed, Maria rifled through the kit and handed several medicines to Naruto, reminding him again that she was trusting his word. Naruto stowed the medicines in his backpack on the floor and thanked Maria. Maria told him not to thank her and began to say that Tommy would inform Joel and Ellie, but she was interrupted when heavy footsteps and a burst of breath announced an abrupt arrival. Eric appeared, flushed from running, and warned that bandits were attacking again. Jackson was a city in every sense of the word. A few kilometers from the power plant, Jackson was protected by high walls, thick gates, varied houses, a tavern, potable water, medicines, a school, and electricity. That electricity came from the Jackson County Power Plant, which used turbines to generate hydroelectric power from the North Teton, making Jackson a proper city, one of the few that operated without supervision from the military or Fedra, who tended to oversee quarantine zones after the Cordyceps outbreak. This was not the case in Jackson. Many who lived there had held countless jobs before the infection or had learned tasks from older members of the community to keep everything running, holding on to the hope that society might one day return. For that reason, the plant was a target for bandits who repeatedly tried to take it. If they cut the power, Jackson would lose the one thing that set it apart from other settlements, and chaos could spread, creating severe problems for everyone. Maria and Tommy, along with the plant workers, were not willing to let outsiders destroy everything they had built and protected. Eric tossed a shotgun toward Naruto. Naruto caught it in midair and, in a fluid motion, pulled the slide back and heard the familiar click as he chambered a round. He had never used a shotgun before. His usual weapons were a Glock, a bow, a katana, and a serrated military knife he kept hidden at his ankle. Eric asked if he knew how to use the shotgun, and Naruto affirmed that he did. Naruto gripped the shotgun with both hands and followed Maria out of the office, raising the barrel as he crossed the threshold. If the bandits were attacking the hydroelectric plant, they would likely head for the generators first. Their plan would be to destroy the generators, cut Jackson's electricity, and then go after the workers. Naruto planned to stop them. He had trained himself to operate in low light and total darkness. He was accustomed to fighting without a flashlight. As he turned toward the generator building, Naruto fired by instinct. The shot struck one of the attackers, sending the man tumbling backward and crashing into some boxes before collapsing, motionless on the floor. One well-placed shot had taken one threat out of the fight. Naruto sprinted and leapt behind a stack of pallets to take cover as gunfire erupted. Two bandits unleashed a volley of bullets that struck the wood, sending splinters flying like confetti. The scene unfolded in rapid, tense bursts as the defenders and attackers engaged in a chaotic, high-energy skirmish. At the moment Naruto heard the click of empty weapons, he stood and fired twice, hitting the two men in the chest like he had the first bandit. They did not react in time and were thrown backward, abandoning the doorway and tumbling down the damp slope, their clothes stained by the mud. He racked the slide and loaded 3 rounds while walking toward the door. He had lost sight of Eric, the big man with the kindly face, and of Maria. He figured Maria had likely gone looking for Tommy and Joel, which left him to deviate from the group. He followed his instinct. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and moved in with the barrel pointed straight ahead. He could see and hear the generators, clicking steadily as they worked to supply power for Jackson. He took a breath, dust prickling his nose, and stepped into the generator room, moving slowly and sweeping his weapon as he searched for the bandits who would be there. He no longer doubted their intent to destroy the generators. He had killed 2 bandits at the entrance who might have been lookouts, and the gunfire from both sides had certainly alerted the rest that someone was coming for the generators. Naruto thought it made sense to take out all the generators, starting with the one farthest from the door. He felt the cold metal of the weapon as his finger brushed the trigger. He settled the stock against his shoulder and squeezed. The shot struck another bandit in the arm. The man recoiled hard, thrown backward as debris scattered across the already dirty floor. Naruto moved to take cover behind a pillar. The bandits regrouped and began to fire. Bullets struck metal, sending sparks and metallic clatter through the room, an echoing, furious din that only grew louder as they shifted positions and alternated fire to pin him behind the pillar. They had turned the room into a wall of bullets that no single person could easily cross. He was human. He could die. Slowly, Naruto crouched and reached to the back pocket of his pants. He found the pin of a hand grenade he had set aside for situations like this, something he had taken from his pack after leaving Maria's office. He apologized quietly to himself, pulled the pin, and rolled the grenade along the floor toward the bandits' legs. Many scattered at the sound, but a couple who had no cover were thrown back when the grenade detonated, a blast of smoke and flying debris marking their removal from the fight. Naruto used that smoke as his curtain. He gripped the Glock in his right hand and the shotgun in his left and advanced, firing as he moved and taking down the bandits with sure, decisive shots. He felt bullets graze his clothing and heard the threat in each missed ricochet. One wrong step could be his last. One of the bandits shouted that Naruto was an idiot. Naruto deflected a swing with his forearm, forcing the man forward. He pressed the barrel of the pistol against the man's temple and fired. The man slumped, neutralized. Another bandit shouted for them to finish him off. Naruto leapt and ducked behind several metal crates, then holstered the Glock with only a couple rounds left and racked the slide on the shotgun. He breathed deeply, the need to survive replacing the shock of what had happened to the point that every sense was sharpened by adrenaline. He told himself it was time to move. He spun and fired, hitting a bandit in the knee. The man fell forward and struck the concrete hard, dazed. He fired again, the shot catching another man in the shoulder and causing that attacker to miss his aim and fall back, clutching his arm. Naruto reloaded the shotgun with several cartridges while crouched behind stacks of metal crates filled with tools. He listened to the bullets ping and skim past, searching for flesh. Only 2 remained. He rose from behind the crates and, when the firing paused, he saw 2 men reloading and looking at him with a mix of surprise and unease. Rather than fire, he closed the distance. He ducked under the butt of the first man's gun and drove an elbow into his stomach. He swung the shotgun but into the face of the second. The strike left the man staggering, blood from his nose beginning to show. Naruto struck the first man in the face, then shifted the Glock so the barrel rested beneath the second man's chin, lifting his jaw. The man with the injured nose growled at the cold metal and remained standing, fury in his eyes. Naruto told them that it was nothing personal but that they had chosen a bad day to try this. He warned that another day he might not be so restrained. One of the men cursed at him in response. Naruto remarked dryly about manners. The pistol clicked on an empty chamber. The man reacted with surprise at the sound. Naruto moved quickly, knocking him down and rendering him unconscious, then checked and confirmed that he was breathing by watching the rise and fall of his chest. He was sure air escaped. Naruto changed the Glock magazine and holstered it, standing up as Maria entered the room, followed by Eric, Tommy and several of Jackson's men, all armed. Maria called his name. Naruto remained standing over the last of the bandits. He spat to the side and turned to face Jackson's leader, her husband and the handful of people from the community who watched with astonishment. Maria asked if he had done this. Naruto shrugged, stepped over the bandit, slung the shotgun Eric had given him over his shoulder and walked toward Jackson's people, met in silence. He did not speak or look back at Tommy or his wife, though Maria remained focused on the defeated attackers. He unhooked the shotgun and placed it in Eric's hands, pushing it against his chest and offering a calm smile. Naruto told Eric to take it, that he would not need it anymore and that he preferred his bow, his sword and his Glock, and thanked him for lending the shotgun. He walked through Jackson's people, turned his back and left the hall in complete silence, leaving them staring at what he had done. One of the men, eyes wide and his weapon trembling, asked if Naruto had done it alone. Tommy said that Joel and Ellie had not been there and wondered whether a boy could be capable of such things. No one answered. Tommy huffed and shook his head, searching for an explanation as he waited for someone to help him make sense of the scene his eyes could not yet accept. Maria stepped forward and said that the boy was a survivor, better than anyone, and that he had spent so long surviving that survival itself was what kept him sane. The next day the clouds had barely thinned. They still covered the sky and a slightly colder breeze moved the tree branches like gentle fingers. Naruto sat on the cot in the room Maria had provided, watching his bare feet while his boots sat together by the door. He rocked his feet back and forth even though they could already touch the floor. He leaned against the wall and felt the cold, dirty concrete against his skin. He slept without a shirt, without pajamas covering his torso, exposing his scars. He crawled to the edge of the bed, put his feet on the cold gray floor and stood, revealing his back. It was not huge but it was defined, muscles showing with movement. The muscles were not the only things that stood out. Scars marked his skin in varying sizes and shapes, scattered across different areas. At least 100 marks covered that skin, some with the rough texture of a burn in the lower back and others like the work of a serrated blade near the shoulder, as if someone had tried to cut deep into his side. Those marks had become a constant reminder, a burden nobody should have to bear. Naruto picked up the shirt Tommy had given him and put it on, covering the scars. He did not examine them, he did not touch them. He had long since stopped checking whether they had faded or remained part of his nightmares. He had partially accepted them as part of his body but refused to let anyone see or touch them, keeping them hidden beneath layers of clothing. He tucked the shirt into his pants, grabbed a short-sleeved black button-up and wore it over the dark green tee. He could pass for a member of the Fireflies in that combination of military colors. He took the locket from the desk and watched it sway in the breeze. The Firefly's symbol was engraved on the metal, a mark he would not let anyone forget. His eyes darkened for a moment before he hung the locket around his neck and tucked it under his shirt, feeling the cold metal against his chest with each step. He thought of Marlene. He took his pistol from the chair holster, secured it at his right hip and placed the magazines on his left. Maria had given him extra magazines and a belt with pouches. He looked more like a soldier now than before he had met Joel and Ellie and gone to Boston in search of the Fireflies. Dressed and ready, he studied his reflection in the cracked mirror. The face that looked back was pale and watchful, calmer than expected. He ran a hand through his blonde hair, slicking it back with a little water, but the rebellious strands continued to stand in every direction. His hair was untamable, a trait inherited from his father. A knock on the door pulled Naruto away from the mirror. He took a deep breath, checked that his pistol was secure and crossed the room in 2 strides. Joel stood on the other side when he opened the door, looking tired with faint shadows under his eyes. Naruto thought the man had aged, probably from the long journey across the country and the strain of the fights against bandits and the infected. Seeing him, Naruto wondered if it might not be better for Tommy to take Ellie to the Fireflies, if that would be better for everyone. Naruto told himself he did not want to kill him. Joel observed that the boy looked healthier. His lips curved into a smile, and Naruto returned it as he closed the door and walked beside the man. Joel admitted that a restful sleep, free from the stress of being hunted, had restored his energy. He put his hands in his pockets and pushed dark thoughts aside, saving them for when he would have to destroy that bridge. He then asked if they were going to speak with Tommy. Joel said that he did. He had information about the Fireflies and where Marlene might be now that she had fled Boston. He spoke with a serious face and tone and confessed that he had tried to get Tommy to bring Ellie to them but had not been able to. He had argued with her and they had reconciled. Naruto raised his right eyebrow in surprise at that revelation. He had thought of Tommy as a possible guide to the Fireflies, a change the group needed, but he had not expected Joel to have suggested it to his brother and to have provoked a confrontation with Ellie. For Naruto, Joel and Ellie were closely bound, albeit in their own way. Joel continued apologetically that he was sorry for having wanted to abandon them. He promised that the 3 of them would finish the journey together. Tommy would point out where Marlene might be and they would leave all this behind. Naruto nodded out of habit, still surprised by the confession. He wondered why Joel had shared it now. Joel had always been reserved, hiding much of his feelings and physical exhaustion. Naruto cursed inwardly and kept silent for a few minutes as they walked toward Maria's office, where Maria, Tommy, and Ellie waited. Naruto wondered aloud in his head why everything had to be so complicated. They reached Maria's office. The room looked as Naruto remembered. A small desk beneath a bank of small windows, shelves on either side of the back wall standing like guards, filled with old, slightly dusty books. Naruto imagined some would fall apart at a touch. Maria and Tommy were already at the desk, leaning over a large map of the country spread out before them. Notes and lines annotated the map, small sticky notes marking locations connected by fine pen lines. Naruto scanned each marked location and memorized them, thinking he might later help Maria and Tommy find supplies for Jackson in thanks for their hospitality and care. Maria looked up from the map and smiled as she recognized Naruto and Joel. She greeted them warmly. Naruto and Joel returned the greeting, and Naruto told Maria that he was feeling much better after a few hours of sleep. Maria studied Naruto's face for a moment, searching for any sign of deception, then relaxed and smiled. She said she was glad to hear it. Tommy pointed at a spot on the map and explained that Ellie was with the horses, gathering supplies for their trip east to the university in Colorado. He indicated the science building at that university as the Fireflies' likely location and said that Marlene and her group had retreated there. Naruto leaned in skeptically and asked whether the Fireflies were really at a university and specifically in the science building. He noted that he had not pictured Marlene as someone interested in science. Tommy admitted that he did not know Marlene's objectives. He had never been in her inner circle despite having been a Firefly. Joel commented dryly that Marlene always had favorites. The remark made Naruto smile faintly. Tommy added that some of Marlene's people had died, mentioning Christopher, a red-haired man who had been in Marlene's inner circle before someone killed him, supposedly after he had been bitten. Naruto observed that if they were lucky the inner circle would be shattered. He suggested that if Marlene had no lieutenants left, they would likely be dealing with her directly. Joel agreed that Marlene did not avoid conversation. Ellie meant a great deal to her, and Marlene would likely speak with them directly so Naruto could give whatever information he had. Tommy said meeting the leader would be an honor and explained that if Naruto were from another cell, Marlene would assign him where she needed him. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the fragile steadiness of the lies he carried with every step. He did not show those doubts and only shrugged before looking at Tommy. Naruto said that, honor aside, he needed to give the information. It was the only reason he had kept traveling. He added that his interest in working with them had waned. He valued the peace of mind he was rebuilding. Maria smiled gently, and Tommy's smile widened. Joel said nothing aloud but appeared more relaxed, his shoulders less tense. Maria suggested that Naruto could visit Jackson once they finished. Naruto grinned broadly and said he would gladly stop by to help the community. A short neutral pause followed as they prepared to set out. Naruto told Maria and Tommy that they had done a great deal for him and he intended to repay them, even if they refused. Tommy explained that they had prepared 2 horses for them since there were 3 travelers, and that they had packed extra supplies assuming Naruto would use his bow. He added that Ellie had carefully prepared Naruto's pack, choosing what he would wear and carry. Naruto said he would thank her. Naruto stepped forward and hugged Maria while Joel squeezed his brother's hand. Then Naruto accepted Tommy's offered hand and Joel hugged Maria in return. Tommy drew Naruto close to speak privately and warned him to take care of his brother, saying he was relieved Naruto wanted to leave the Fireflies but that Marlene was dangerous. He urged Naruto to watch over the 3 of them and keep an eye on Joel. Naruto nodded silently, though his thoughts churned with darker intentions. He was thinking of killing Joel, not protecting him. From Jackson, the 3 of them took a month to reach Colorado State University, a journey that was calm for the most part. They traveled steadily on horseback along empty roads, through silent forests, and past a few abandoned settlements, always aware of the infected that lingered nearby. The rain had stopped as they rode, but the sky remained a pale, wintry gray, as if snow could fall at any moment. Autumn had been wet and cold, and winter crept in a day at a time. During the trip to the university, Naruto, Joel, and Ellie had to add layers to stay warm. Tommy and Maria had given them jackets and sweaters that shielded them from the damp and temperature swings, helping them avoid illness during the constant storms. Despite detours and difficulties, the 3 finally reached Colorado State University after a little over a month, riding 2 horses. Naruto and Ellie shared a chestnut mare, and Joel rode a sturdy dark horse named Callus. Joel carried the supplies and provisions from Jackson, packed in saddlebags and backpacks slung behind the saddle, while both horses bore extra gear in their panniers for quick access. Naruto had never ridden a horse before the mare's reins were placed in his hands. The animal regarded him with large, dark eyes and accepted him as a rider. Naruto stroked the mare, and the animal leaned into his touch. He became responsible for guiding her, with Ellie seated behind him and holding him at the waist. Joel broke the silence with an observation, noting that the main campus building looked like a giant mirror. He had been looking at the main university building and felt as though its facade reflected an emptiness back at them. The name on the sign above the gates was illegible, with letters missing or corroded by time. Naruto patted the mare's neck and remarked that the place felt too quiet to be a Firefly's stronghold, especially if Marlene had been at the science building. The few plants they saw had grown wild through cracks in the pavement and up the foundations of the buildings. Near some structures the vegetation seemed trimmed and maintained recently, suggesting that someone, perhaps the Fireflies or other survivors, had been at the university not long ago. Joel dismounted Callus, pushed open the rusted gate with a noisy creak, and told them to stay in sight and remain close together, specifically instructing Ellie to stay beside Naruto. Ellie acknowledged the instruction and hopped down, pressing the mare to guide both horses through the partially loosened gate. The buildings near the entrance showed signs of neglect. The university's pale facade was stained and worn, with dusty windows that revealed no movement or life. Naruto scanned the surroundings for any sign of activity but found only silence and stillness. He picked up his bow and checked his arrows, commenting that it seemed too quiet and that he did not believe Marlene and her group remained on the campus. Given the pressure the Fireflies had been under from the military and Fedra, he suspected they would have moved their operations elsewhere. Naruto doubted that Marlene's research would be straightforward or successful, though he recognized what her work likely involved: a frantic effort toward a cure. He remained skeptical of the promises of progress, feeling that her haste and secrecy left room for suspicion. He was still missing his main element, his prized asset. Naruto thought that trying to find a cure was a waste of time. He placed his right hand on the weapon's grip and swept his eyes across the surrounding buildings. Naruto scanned every window for movement, whether it belonged to a Firefly, an infected, or something else lurking in the shadows. At the same time, he kept an eye on Ellie, who gazed at the campus map and university brochures with fascination. Their parents had gone to the university. Naruto recalled that his mother always showed him hidden photos from when she and his father graduated. They had attended the University of Washington and had seemed to have devoted their lives to science, at least before the outbreak and the infection. He had left their lab coats behind at his old shelter, where he and his sister had lived for a time before being taken in by that man's community. Naruto whispered David's name and clenched his jaw. He had sworn not to think about him or his past, but it was impossible, even 7 years after leaving everything behind and surviving on his own. It was a nightmare he kept hidden. Naruto reassured himself that Joel would be fine. He thought Joel had survived 20 years and that moving around here would not be a problem for him. Naruto looked toward Ellie and urged her to stop worrying so much. He reminded himself aloud that they had made it this far through countless hardships and that Joel would not be defeated easily. He promised that at the first sign of danger he would help Joel. Those words allowed Naruto to force a small, sincere smile, the first since his sister's death 7 years earlier, mainly to keep Ellie from worrying about Joel or them. He still hid his true feelings about Joel behind a mask. Naruto admired the man but also feared what Joel might do once they reached Marlene. He worried whether Joel would simply leave them with her or reveal Ellie outright, given what Marlene would do if Ellie turned out to be immune. Naruto could see Marlene's plan to weave everything together in a bid to save the world with a cure, and he feared that would end Ellie's future and autonomy. Ellie did not seem entirely convinced by Naruto's reassurances. She remained worried about Joel's safety and the accidents he might encounter walking alone through the area. The memory of how Joel had killed a man to protect her made her frown further. After several minutes, Joel finally reemerged. The university gates stood wide open and he looked flushed and a little out of breath, pistol in hand. Joel reported that he had not seen any Fireflies but had found plenty of infected, and he suggested they proceed to the science building. Joel took the reins of Callus from Naruto, who nodded. The three moved again across the campus following the map toward the science building. It made no sense to search other buildings if the Fireflies were operating here. That would only waste time and resources and might lead them into unnecessary confrontations. Banners and symbols of the Fireflies were strewn across the campus. Barricades placed behind doors forced the trio into wide detours, but eventually they reached the university's science building, which appeared abandoned. Unlike some other structures, this one had been relatively well maintained, though it was as quiet as the rest and gave no immediate sign of Firefly presence. Naruto and Joel tied up their horses and climbed the small steps to the building entrance. They entered silently with flashlights on. Ellie walked between them. Joel led the group while Naruto brought up the rear, constantly glancing back to make sure they were not followed. They found the bodies of what appeared to be fireflies scattered on the floor, casualties of a recent confrontation. Some had been wounded by weapons, some showed bite marks, and one had clearly been killed in a brutal struggle with an advanced infected. There were no signs of survivors in the building, and their hope dwindled with each cleared room as they searched for Marlene or her lead researcher. Naruto picked up some yellow documents and shone his flashlight across the printed lines. He noted that tests had been performed on monkeys in search of a cure and that Marlene had been working in secret from this location. Joel examined other folders and observed that the university had served as a Firefly base for an extended PRD. They entered a large lecture hall where a whiteboard was covered in half-erased scribbles. The body of a scientist lay near the professor's lectern, a clear indication of a violent attack. Joel remarked that the Fireflies had likely used the university as a fixed point for too long. Ellie lifted another folder and waved it urgently to get their attention. Naruto put away some papers in his backpack and followed Joel as Ellie indicated that Marlene was at St. Mary Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah, and that operations had been moved there. Joel muttered that it might be the Fireflies' new base and that it was careless to leave this information exposed. The army might already be heading there. He considered it their last lead and said they would have to go whether they wanted to or not. Joel tore down a map from the wall with notes on it and stashed it, slightly crumpled, into his pack. They prepared to leave the building and continue towards St. Mary Hospital. Ellie urged that the sooner they left, the sooner they would get to the hospital. They left the lounge and went down the hallway toward the stairs that led to the entrance, the only route without a barricade forcing them to circle the entire building. They had to bypass several roadblocks and jammed doors to reach that floor. A creak alerted them, but it was already too late. A man lunged at Joel, pushing him, and both went through the window amid the crash of shattered glass, a cry, and the loud neighing of horses. Ellie cried out in alarm at Joel. She leaned out and saw that a barbed stake had struck Joel and left him badly hurt. The attacker was getting up, dragging a wounded leg. As he drew a machete, an arrow flew and struck him, dropping him. Naruto had already placed a second arrow on his bow, turned, released the string, and sent the into the knee of a second bandit, dropping him to the ground face first. Naruto ordered them to pick up Joel and said he would follow. When someone hesitated, Naruto insisted that they go. A third bandit grabbed Naruto and shoved him against a door, forcing it open, and they both tumbled inside. The bow flew from the boy's hands and skidded several meters away. A rough voice taunted Naruto, greeting him as if they were old acquaintances. Naruto leaned back, narrowly avoiding the swing of an axe. He staggered, crashed into the desk, and jumped as the two-handed axe split the wood. The attacker wrenched the axe free and surveyed Naruto with a mocking satisfaction. For a moment, gray and blue eyes met. The man mentioned 7 years and David, implying he expected to claim Naruto's head. Blood trickled down the right side of Naruto's face from a cut above his eyebrow. He kept that eye nearly shut, pressing the lid tight to prevent the wound from worsening, which limited his vision and left his right side vulnerable. He gripped a military knife in reverse, the handle settling comfortably in his hand as if the blade were an extension of his arm. His movements remained fluid and precise. Naruto squared his shoulders against the desk. More bandits had entered the room and surrounded the only exit. A brick wall blocked his back unless he could reach the horse at the entrance where explosive arrows and charges were stowed. He regretted not having them within reach. He wiped the blood from his face with the back of his right hand and opened his eye just enough to form a narrow slit, careful not to force it and make the wound worse. He realized, with mounting anger, that these men were sent by David. David had been the man who had taken Naruto and his sister in after their mother died and their father disappeared. He had seemed kind and offered guidance and training to help them survive. They had trusted him. Naruto had been wrong to trust that smile and that false paternal charm. For a year David had hidden darker motives behind that face. Naruto had not seen what David wanted from them or from his sister. Seeing Garrick, one of David's most loyal men, in the room fueled Naruto's fury. He clung to the knife as if to a last anchor to sanity. He could not tell if Ellie had jumped with Joel and escaped or if they had been captured and taken to David, a thought that made his hands tighten on the weapon. He tried to reach for the pistol at his hip, but one of Garrick's men lunged and forced him aside. By reflex, Naruto drove the knife into the attacker's hand, causing the man to cry out and drop a barbed bat. Naruto seized the bat and swung. The blow struck hard and sent the man sprawling onto his back, stunned and badly hurt. Naruto held the weapon steady for a moment, breathing fast. He did not advance on the group surrounding Garrick. Garrick watched him with a sneer, clinging to a fireman's axe with both hands. Naruto noticed dried residue on the blade and the axe's worn haft. He inhaled deeply, shoulders lifting, then let out a long, controlled exhale, keeping his gaze fixed on Garrick, on the man who had been there while his sister was harmed. He tightened his grip on both the knife and the bat and lifted his chin, meeting Garrick's stare with defiant intensity. Two more men moved toward him, encouraged by what they read as arrogance. Naruto reacted in the same instant, dropping the bat toward the first man's legs and bringing the edge down to take him off balance. He bent low and struck, avoiding a machete swing, and used the moment to drive the knife into the instep of the second man as he followed through, then brought the bat down on the first, leaving him dazed and on the floor. The machete-wielding man howled in pain and fury and swung the blade again. Naruto parried with his knife, forcing the attacker to recoil and put weight on his injured foot. Naruto seized the moment, swung the bat, and struck the bandit on the left side, sending him crashing into the table and tearing his shirt. He gripped the bat and the knife tightly, rising slowly with his eyes fixed on Garrick, daring him to come. He wanted Garrick to lunge. He craved that the man would attack again with the firefighter's axe that had already hurt others. Garrick responded with a predatory grin. Towering at about 7 feet, broad-shouldered and imposing, he stepped aside from his men and walked heavily toward the boy, dragging the axe and creating a high, metallic whistle that could belong in a horror film. He saw no fear in Naruto's blue eyes, only a cold, focused intensity aimed squarely at him. Naruto's right eye was fully open despite the wound above his eyebrow. That steadiness widened Garrick's smile. He took pleasure in the thought of crushing the boy while he was whole, unbroken. Garrick lifted the axe and swung a brutal horizontal blow meant to land with overwhelming force. Naruto rolled across the table and fell to the far side, avoiding the worst of the strike. The axe continued in a vertical arc and smashed the table in two with a thunderous crack, splinters flying between them like a curtain. The force behind the blow was immense, the work of a man with terrifying strength. Naruto tried to reach for his pistol, but Garrick attacked again with increased speed. The knife flew from Naruto's hand and the bat snapped, sending splinters into his forearm. He bit his lip at the sudden pain. Garrick raised the axe and stepped down with power, bringing the blade toward Naruto's shoulder. Naruto leapt aside and the axe struck the floor, rebounding and throwing Garrick off balance. Naruto charged, shoulder-checking Garrick and pushing him back a few steps. Naruto drew a butterfly knife from his waist and struck at Garrick's side as Garrick lifted the axe for another blow. Garrick staggered and cried out. Naruto dropped back, just in time to avoid the wild swing that followed. He slid backward until there were 2 meters between them. Garrick seized the knife and ripped it free with a wince, the wound making him grimace as he clenched his teeth. Garrick spat a curse and, through gritted teeth, forced the axe upright. He declared that he would take Naruto's head, lifting the weapon even as his injured side hurt with each movement. Naruto did not flinch. He had used the butterfly knife and his pistol was still in its holster, but he reached for it with steady hands. Naruto caressed the pistol's grip and told Garrick that David would soon join them, that karma would return all the pain they had caused, and he called Garrick a monster. Garrick answered with a violent curse. Naruto fired the pistol. The bandit's eyes widened. The bullet struck Garrick in the chest and he fell to his knees, the axe clattering from his hand. Silence filled the room. Naruto holstered the pistol and bent to take the heavy firefighter's axe Garrick had been using. It was at least 1 meter long and required 2 hands to wield properly. He rested it on his shoulder and looked at the remaining men. All of them belonged to David's group, men who had ruined trust and broken the lives of many survivors. Naruto told them that 7 years ago he had escaped from David, Garrick, James, and the others who had destroyed his sister's life. He said that fate had left them alive, that it was unfair to all the people they had harmed, and that he could not accept it. He admitted that he was selfish and that he would not pretend to be a saint. He accepted that taking their lives might damn him, and he was prepared for that consequence. Then he declared that, before anything else, he would send them all to face what they deserved. He swung the axe. The first bandit who charged him was knocked back and crashed into a pile of boxes. The cold of winter replaced the damp chill of autumn. Fierce winds stung the ears and snow fell constantly, building into drifts that rose to the knees, hampering movement and driving people indoors. It was also a time when the infected fell into a light torpor, frozen by the cold and snow, often buried under meters of ice. At other times it was common to see their limbs protruding from the snow like pale, motionless flowers, entirely stiff and unmoving. The living and animals sought shelter, bundling themselves in thick layers of clothing, building fires and, when possible, keeping warm with heated water. Animals, not dependent on human comforts and hardened by hostile environments, adapted quickly to adverse weather, finding refuge in unexpected places. Many anticipated the harsher season and stocked caches of food in their shelters to survive the long, heavy winter that year. Since the outbreak and the spread of the infection, the world had become less contaminated, more governed by nature than by people. Technological advances were mostly abandoned. Vehicles were a luxury for the few lucky enough to have fuel and a functioning car. Pollution fell as corporations shut down and cities emptied. Communities like Jackson settled near water and renewable energy sources such as wind or hydro, relying on the land itself to sustain the settlement. There were not many permanent settlements. Most survivor groups were nomadic, moving from one place to another to find supplies and endure the winter. Fishing, hunting, and foraging grew more difficult away from quarantine zones. Rations were scarce and hard to come by. Despite the adversity, bundled under a heavy coat with his hood up and his hands in thick gloves, Naruto walked steadily, leading his mare by the bridle. He had named the horse Beatrice in honor of an elderly woman who had fed and cared for him when his mother was ill, and also for the reddish tone of her coat. The woman had kept her red hair into her 60s, the same vivid hue as the animal's fur. The bow hung from the saddle and the quiver of arrows was in place. A deer was lashed to Beatrice's hindquarters with thick rope Naruto had taken from a supply store, the same rope he had used before. A Glock was fastened to his right hip. A military knife, clean and sharp, was tucked into his left boot, and a butterfly knife was hidden at the back of his waist. With the heavy clothing he wore, reaching that small blade was awkward. The dense layers protected him but limited mobility. He resolved that improving speed and agility would come first, and the bulky clothes would have to be adjusted later. Where he usually left his face exposed, he now wore a thick black cloth mask covering the lower half of his face up to the bridge of his nose, leaving only his blue eyes visible. Between the mask, the hood, and his unusually long hair, only his intense blue eyes showed, giving him the air of a predator, a hunter preparing to stalk his next target. In a way, that was accurate. Naruto had been separated from Ellie and Joel at the university because of Garrick's group. That left him with few options. He had to be a hunter, to track the routes Ellie might have taken while carrying Joel, who was badly hurt and likely to need medication to prevent infection, fever, and other complications from the wound. Knowing this, he had searched every inch of the university, collecting as many medicine bottles and canned supplies as he could to help them through part of the winter. He had assumed it would be easy to find them. He had not expected snowstorms to begin so early or to be so heavy. Footprints and tracks were erased by the first snows, complicating everything. He was not an animal with a keen sense of smell that could follow a living trail. Even scents faded in the damp of fresh snowfall. For Naruto, it simply made the task a bit harder. He hoped Ellie had taken Joel far from the university and had not left him behind. Even so, Naruto knew where he needed to go. He had stayed near the campus for practical reasons. Joel was gravely wounded, barely able to move and unlikely to make it back to Jackson, and the university had become a dangerous place, watched by bandits. The area was ringed by wolves. The crunch of snow stopped when he paused and lifted his hood to study a thick wooden door ahead of him, ready to be pushed open. He led Beatrice to a stable at the side of the building and began to untie the saddle, the deer, and the reins, freeing the mare from the weight of his gear. He left the saddle on the fence and lifted the deer into his arms, feeling its weight settle against him. With a firm motion he set it down on a wooden table, which creaked and shifted slightly, scattering a little sawdust onto the packed earth and straw floor. He breathed heavily, his warm breath fogging in the cold air. Surviving in an apocalyptic world offered none of the comforts of 20 years earlier. There were no supermarkets, no farms selling meat, no people trading eggs, fish, or milk. Everything hinged on ration cards that provided the basics for at most a week and served as payment for work in quarantine zones. Those living outside quarantine had to hunt and fend for themselves. He wiped his hands, checked his weapons, and readied himself to push the door and continue the search. Only those willing to get their hands dirty could stay alive in conditions like that. Naruto had been lucky. He and his sister had been trained by their father, who insisted on teaching them everything he knew from his life and military service. Naruto soaked up those lessons like a sponge, even more eagerly than Mito. He always excelled at survival skills, learning useful things that would keep him alive. His father had also taught him how to use a weapon. Naruto wrinkled his nose. Killing animals did not please him, but it was a necessity. Winter made planting impossible and food scarce, so he trapped whatever might be eaten. His father had drilled into him to hunt only the old or the sick, never the young or a mother with her young. Naruto followed that rule every time he took game, choosing animals that seemed ready to leave the world. The fire crackled, flames dancing under the blue gaze of the young man. He sat in the cabin's main room around the hearth, watching the heavy iron pot set over the flames as it simmered the meat, potatoes, and small pieces of carrot he had thrown in without much care. Naruto had grown used to Ellie's presence and Joel's taciturn face. Now, alone again, a weight settled over him like drowsiness, a fatigue that dulled his edges. He wondered whether it was the winter cold or the loneliness that had crept back after months of company. His thoughts and Beatrice were his only real companions. The thoughts were not always kind. Beatrice was the only one who offered him comfort. She was his trusted companion. Naruto gave a dry laugh as he ladled some of the improvised stew into his bowl. The smell of cooked meat and potatoes rose to his nose, but the stew was bland short on salt and seasoning. He pushed the wooden spoon into the bowl, scooped meat and potato, and ate without ceremony. Heat spread down his throat and warmed his chest, and he sighed. Naruto thought that his mother had cooked better. He also thought his father had cooked better. He remembered his parents and his sister. David had been a constant memory too, a reminder that the world still harbored monsters who knew who Naruto was and hunted him relentlessly. If David was looking for him, he would also look for Ellie and Joel. Naruto feared that Joel might consider turning Ellie over to Marlene's people. He hoped that was not the case. He worried that the scientists' studies of the Cordyceps might end with Ellie on an operating table in a hospital gown, treated as an object for experiments. His left hand closed around the locket, feeling the cold metal and tracing the engraving of the terrorist group with his fingertip. The girl's name had been Natalie, Christopher's daughter, the same man Naruto had killed before the man turned. She had ended up in the same hands that wanted Ellie, intended for the same purpose. Naruto murmured that he would probably have to wait for the snow to melt at least a little before he could find any trail that would lead him to them. Searching for Ellie and Joel was difficult, especially if they were hiding from David and his men. Tracking David's men, however, was easier. David had never been a man to plan far ahead, though he could be cautious. Killing Garrick and the others at the university had hidden his involvement in that incident, which Naruto was grateful for. He could move like a snake through the deep snow and strike silently. Voices outside made Naruto slide back from the window and tuck himself behind the wall, though he kept watching. 4 armed men trudged together through snow that reached nearly to their knees. They carried hunting rifles, and Naruto saw the handle of a machete tucked under one man's jacket. It seemed unlikely they were simple travelers. It had been weeks since he had seen any other soul near the farm. The men whispered among themselves. One of the men said he would check the barn to see if there were any signs of the girl or the man. Naruto almost lost his grip. He had nearly reached for the Glock, ready to fire through the window at the 4 trackers. The thought that they could be David's men settled in his mind and only grew stronger. What other group would be searching for a girl and a man in this area if not David's? 3 of the men moved onto the porch and tested the step with boots. Naruto heard their dry laughter and their talk about the girl and what David wanted to do with her. One man called out that they had found a deer track, proof that someone was in the house, and another said he smelled food. They argued about taking the supplies for themselves. Naruto wound his left hand around the rope hanging by the door, preparing himself as the men began to spread out. The 4th man walked toward them, dragging his weapon with a smug smile. He pulled the cord. A metallic crash sent a flurry of sharp objects down onto the 3 men on the porch, tangling in their clothing and forcing 2 of them to drop their firearms. The 3rd man raised his gun, but Naruto fired through the window of the door, striking him and forcing him to fall back and drop his weapon. Naruto warned them not to touch the weapons, then took the doorknob and opened the door. He ordered the man who had stopped with his foot on the top step to drop the hunting rifle, and the man reluctantly released it. Naruto admitted that he was also looking for a man and a girl as he stepped onto the porch. The other men backed away to give him room. He said that he knew who they worked for and what they were capable of, and he asked whether David remained deceitful and dangerous. One of the men demanded to know who Naruto was. Naruto answered by firing, striking the man in the face and knocking him backwards so he could no longer respond. Naruto repeated his question about David, and before anyone could answer, he fired again, hitting the man at the top step and sending him stumbling off the porch. The last bandit panicked and said they were indeed searching for a girl and a man. He claimed those people had killed friends and members of their university community and had attacked them with an axe. The man added that an axe had been left behind in the confrontation. Naruto told them that he had dealt with their friends and that he had ended those threats at the university and afterward. He pressed the barrel of his weapon against the remaining man's chest and demanded answers now that they knew who and what he was. The Silver Lake Resort had become, among its wooden cabins, a small district buried under dense snow, battered by winter storms and occupied mainly by an isolated band of survivors. That band had slowly dwindled, thinned by scarce resources and clashes with other groups after the outbreak, forcing them into drastic measures to keep going. Those measures turned the survivors inward, cautious, cunning, and suspicious, relying on persuasion and manipulation to convince others to join and make the group stronger. At least, that was the appearance. Need and desperation distorted people into something they barely recognized. Minds fractured and madness seeped in, turning questionable and unethical behaviors into the only apparent path to survival. The resort group hardened into genuine survivors living on the edge, doing whatever they thought necessary to last another week. Ellie had discovered what the group hid and what they wanted from her, and she understood how they would try to bend her to their will, to use her as another tool. David, the leader, had shown her that when he kept her confined behind iron bars. He had explained what they did to survive while his back was turned, cutting food with a knife. From the moment she had met him after hunting a deer and surviving an attack by infected, Ellie had felt uneasy around David and his companion. Her suspicion became certainty. They were members of the group that had ambushed them at the university, the same group that had wounded Joel and likely killed Naruto. The boy had vanished for weeks, and Ellie had been forced to care for Joel because of his injury, hunting and scavenging for supplies and medicine to survive the winter and keep the wound from becoming infected. That exposed her to David and his men when she went out to hunt. David had tried to persuade her to give them the animal. She had resisted and trained her rifle on them. She could not allow them to take the deer without compensation. By chance she learned they had the medicine Joel needed, and she offered the deer in exchange. David hid his displeasure better than his companion, but they reached an agreement. She would get the medicine and they would take the animal. But she had made a mistake. David's men tracked her back to the cabin compound where she and Joel hid. To protect Joel, Ellie had led the men away from his location. The plan failed and she ended up locked in a cell. She woke to David standing with his back to her while he spoke, his breath unpleasant and his presence too close. He had said there was still hope she would see things his way and join him and his group. He had even given her food, which she had not eaten, pushing it away in disgust at the smell. Seeing the normalcy with which David moved and the way he justified their actions woke something in Ellie and offered a chance to escape. She grabbed that chance as if it were a lifeline. She broke out of the cell and slipped through the starlit streets between the cabins. She hid in what looked like a large tavern, crouched behind the counter, holding her breath so no one would detect her. Her only weapon was the knife she always carried, her last line of defense. Time stretched as Ellie crouched behind the bar, listening. She doubted David would simply try to talk her into joining him now. He was not a man who gave many chances. He wanted her, and the abruptness of her escape likely stoked his intent. She worried he might come to end the pursuit or force her to change her mind. Her dark thoughts were confirmed when she heard David's boot hit the first plank of the small three-step entrance to the tavern. He whistled and moved through the room, scraping the bigger knife against the tables as he passed. The knife was large and intimidating, capable of inflicting serious harm. David stopped in the middle of the tavern and slammed the blade down on a table. The strike splintered the surface and sent small shards of wood skittering up. His dominant arm showed the strength he took pride in. Ellie, shaken, pressed herself lower and held still to avoid being seen. David did not move for several minutes. He scanned the empty tables and seats, glanced toward the kitchen beyond the counter, and studied the narrow passages formed by the arrangement of dusty sofas and chairs. He stood there, listening as if hunting for any sound that might give him away. Calmly, David wrapped his fingers around the knife handle and pulled it free with a sharp tug, the sound echoing through the room. David told her that she should stop hiding, calling her little lamb, and resumed pacing slowly, step by step, peering carefully behind sofas and under tables. He warned that she could not hide forever and that he already smelled her. The deeper timbre of David's voice made Ellie shudder, and she tightened her grip on the knife. She closed her eyes and wished David would vanish, that the echo of footsteps and his voice were only a nightmare she would wake from back in the cabin with Joel and Naruto. Ellie missed the teenager despite her first impressions of him. She thought of Naruto as reserved, secretive, and good at hiding things, although the change in the brightness of his eyes had told her many times that he lied about something she did not know. He had seemed honest, kind, and self-sacrificing in many ways. He had done everything to reach them in Pittsburgh, cared for them at university, and looked after Maria and the others in Jackson. He was not cruel like David and seemed to hold some steady ethics, like a normal person. The contrast between David and Naruto felt enormous to her. David continued to taunt her to stop hiding. Ellie shuddered but tried to steady her mind and push away the memories. She held the knife ready. She recalled saving Joel from a hunter in Pittsburgh. This felt similar, she told herself. If she could strike a decisive blow, it would end this and protect others in the community. The sudden sound of gunfire cut David's voice for a few seconds before he let out a dry, mocking laugh. Ellie inched behind the bar, belly pressing against her knees, trying to find a way to surprise David from behind. When the moment came, with gunfire still ringing in the background, Ellie leapt at David and attempted to plunge the knife toward his throat. David seized her arm and used her momentum to throw her against a table. Her back struck the wood, breath knocked out of her for a few seconds, long enough for David to kick the knife from her hand and clamp his dirty fingers around her neck, tightening until she scrambled for air. Tears welled up and ran down her cheeks. She kicked, and David slapped her hard enough to sting and make her ear ring. The sting made her press her lips together. She could taste metal in her mouth but could not spit it out. David leaned close and told Ellie to stop resisting. She tried to kick again, and another slap sent her crashing to the floor. Using her arms, she crawled across the grimy wooden boards, jacket snagging on loose nails and splinters. Each inch she gained left more pain in her hands and tiny splinters embedded in her skin. David shouted for her to stop playing. Ellie screamed to be released. He grabbed her jacket and hurled her against another table. Ellie bit down on her fear, turned, and struck at David's face with a punch born of fury. David told her that this was not how one hit a man, grabbed her by the hair, and shoved her face to the tabletop. He suggested she might have twisted her wrist or even broken a finger, looking with a kind of cruel curiosity at her reddened hand. David said he was tired of playing and tired of being good, that he would not tolerate her as an outsider much longer. For a moment neither of them reacted further. Ellie felt captive, breathless with David pressing her to the table. Then a firm hand seized the back of David's jacket and threw him forcefully against a stack of boxes. Naruto shouted at David to never touch her again. Ellie's tear-filled eyes brightened into something like relief as she crawled out from under the table and took cover behind Naruto's tall figure. David rose and for the first time, looked at the blue-eyed teenager. He blinked, confused, then erupted into a strained, lurching laugh, the sound edged with hysteria. He managed to control it somewhat and sneered that the little Naruto had grown teeth and wondered if the boy was ready for another lesson. Only silence answered. Naruto glanced over his shoulder at Ellie with a warm, steady look and asked if she was all right. She gave a trembling affirmative. The single quiet word came with a quiver and wet eyes. Naruto took a breath and met David's dark, mocking gaze. David taunted the boy, wondering if he would try to redeem himself. In response, Naruto acted with swift determination. He used the iron chains nearby to restrain David's arm, pulling hard in a controlled, decisive motion. A loud snap filled the room and David cried out, collapsing to his knees and clutching his arm. Naruto's blue eyes were calm as he told Ellie to come out. He released the chains and David sank to the floor, kneeling and holding his injured limb. Naruto stood between them, back to David, focused entirely on the girl. Naruto promised Ellie that he would not lose her. The two of them, green and blue, looked at each other. Slowly, Ellie rose and Naruto handed her his backpack, pressing it gently into her hands. David laughed weakly at the sight of their bond and then coughed. Blood trickled from his nose and he lowered his head, feeling the pain of the impact. He felt the warmth of blood on his upper lip, soaking his unkempt beard. Naruto ordered David to be quiet. Naruto turned and stood in front of David. The man was kneeling, head bowed, blood dripping from his chin. Naruto looked at him as if he were a wounded animal. Naruto told David he would not leave and that he would make sure of it. David tried to protest about the others, but Naruto replied coldly that none of them were breathing. Naruto's voice grew so cold that his breath misted in the air. David flinched despite the pain and lifted his face. Naruto considered that movement a grave mistake. He struck David again, knocking him onto his back with a painful impact. David cried out and coughed, his injuries becoming worse without graphic detail. Naruto accused David of having harmed his sister and of exploiting Naruto when he was a child. He made it clear that this was the reason he had come for him. Naruto wrapped a length of iron chain around his right hand and began to swing it, the metal cold against his skin. He said that David had turned him into something with little mercy, a person hardened by the past. Memories poured out of Naruto like a flood. Tears began to fall from his thin cheeks to the dusty ground. He kept both hands clenched, the chain coiled around his right fist. Naruto, without hesitation, struck repeatedly until David's mouth and face were wrecked by the force of the blows. David slammed into a table and made a sharp sound on impact, the force leaving him unable to move. He looked at Naruto with wide, terrified eyes. Naruto told him that he had warned him as a child he would come back, that he had been mocked and underestimated, and that now, for his sister and for Ellie, he intended to bury him in darkness. The harshest memories faded with the dawn the next day. The storm had subsided, leaving a thick blanket of snow across the ground that reached an adult's knees. If a child walked there, they might sink from their light weight and disappear from view except for the top of their head. The Silver Lake Resort had been reduced to ruins. Thick columns of black smoke rose from buildings gutted by flames. The fire had started in the resort's bar and restaurant and spread like a wave, turning wooden structures into a single, blazing inferno. Now only ash, smoldering ruins, smoke, and a few unresponsive bodies among the debris remained. Naruto, Joel, and Ellie had not stayed to watch the complex burn or to tend to the survivors of David's group. When Naruto left the bar with flames at his back, he had found Joel holding Ellie. They fled the area, leaving David's companions in the snow, some injured and some already dead. They never looked back. Joel led their escape, shooting at anyone who emerged from the surrounding buildings. Ellie kept her head down between them while Naruto pressed her to lower herself. The blonde teenager took position at the rear and fired as they moved. Eventually, the trio hid in a small cabin several kilometers from the resort, leaving behind the survivors of the confrontation with David. Naruto did not expect to miss them. Even though he valued human life and lived to survive, killing David, James, and the rest of that group had felt necessary and even satisfying, but it did not fill the hollow he had carried for 7 years. David and his community had become a scar in Naruto's past, a division between who he had been and who he had become, as stark as night falling without evening. After David's death, Naruto admitted to himself that he had become like the thing that had destroyed his family, a hardened person driven by survival, ready to kill to protect those he loved. He had shown that in Pittsburgh, where he had killed a handful of hunters and infected without hesitation, and again at the dam when he eliminated bandits, witnessed by Maria, Tommy, and several members of his community. Now, after the fight at the university and at the ranch, and especially after the confrontation with David, it was clear that the kind boy he once had been had faded away like water slipping through fingers. Surviving in that world meant doing things nobody would consider under normal circumstances. David and his people had gone to extremes to find food and shelter, and Naruto understood that he was no different from David. He had crossed a line and let himself fall into the jaws of a beast that swallowed him whole, leaving him surrounded by darkness, pain, and sorrow. He had cried in front of David, letting go of the last of his feelings. Joel interrupted him, noting that Naruto had seemed withdrawn since they fled and asking if he had known those men. After leaving the resort in flames and ash, they had found an abandoned cabin with firewood and canned food in a small pantry, and thick blankets that looked as though they had come from massive brown bears. The cabin was modest, a little over 40 square meters, with a small bed against the right wall, a square table in the center of the main room, and a gas stove on the left. A fireplace was set into the wall between the bed and the stove, and a medium stack of firewood sat to the left of the hearth. It looked like a refuge for other survivors or perhaps the cabin of someone relatively well off, judging by the supplies, medicine, and a hunting shotgun hidden in an old splintered trunk under the bed, the initials FGC faintly inked on the lid. They had been lucky to find this shelter and luckier still that it had not been looted. Perhaps its occupants had left only recently. They might have become infected or been killed by David or other bandits. Naruto admitted that he had known them and that he had lived with them from 9 to 10 years old. Ellie lay on the bed asleep, exhausted from what had happened at the resort. Naruto and Joel sat by the fire, watching the flames lick the wood and pop. Joel observed that those people had not seemed good. Naruto fixed his eyes on the flames and explained that David had broken his sister, his last family after their parents died. Naruto said that David had manipulated and traumatized her to the point that she had ultimately disappeared into the ranks of the infected, if someone had not ended her suffering. Joel remained quiet, listening to Ellie's soft snores and the crackle of the fire. Those were the only sounds inside. Even though there was no storm outside, Joel could not hear anything else, not even the creak of snow beneath weight. For the first time in a while he felt he could breathe a little. Naruto continued, saying that David and his community had left deep marks on his life and on Ellie's. He said that this was an undeniable part of their story and that the only consolation was knowing David was dead and could no longer hurt anyone else. Naruto expressed regret that he had not arrived in time for Ellie. Joel told him that Ellie was grateful he had come to her aid and that he had seen it in her eyes when she ran out of the bar. Joel admitted he did not know what might have happened if Naruto had not shown up, and he thought that killing David in that moment would have been deeply traumatic for her. Naruto muttered that David had been a living trauma. He explained that Ellie had been marked by David, just as his sister and he had been marked. Naruto acknowledged that Ellie might not be broken in the same way he was or transformed like others, but she carried David's mark for the rest of her life. He insisted he was as sure of this as he was of his own name, Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto was certain that David's influence warped minds. He had seen how the man's actions left people as hollow versions of themselves, drifting without a life to live. Many chose death or even infection to stop feeling. Those who could not bring themselves to leave simply vanished without explanation. David had been one of many monsters erased from the world as norms and rules dissolved like morning mist. Joel remarked that it must have been hard to live alone for 7 years. Naruto corrected him, saying it had been 8 and that he had just turned 18 on October 10th. Joel's mouth twisted into a faint smile. Small things like birthdays had faded from many calendars. For some, marked dates were the only moments they allowed themselves a little light. Joel had let his own birthday slip into the forgotten reaches of a life that existed before the outbreak and quarantine zones. There was nothing to be gained by remembering it. Joel explained that before the outbreak, becoming an adult granted certain freedoms. You could drive, own a first firearm, marry, and do many things younger people needed permission to do. In the United States, adulthood came at 18, though some rights came at 16 and others at 21. In other countries, Joel observed that the age for those things varied. Naruto responded that, then, he supposed he could already drive. Joel laughed and replied that if they were in a normal world, yes, but he thought Naruto had driven before. Naruto admitted that he must have escaped a horde of infected once and had used an old police car to flee the city, dodging abandoned vehicles, chunks of concrete, potholes, and 100 other hazards. Surprisingly, he had not died on his first time driving. Naruto did not mention that his first drive had been soon after escaping David, when his small stature barely let him reach the pedals and had nearly sent him over a cliff. He was thankful to have grown taller, enough to drive and do things without asking for help. Naruto broke the silence again and, holding the locket hanging from his neck with his right hand so Joel would not see, said that the trip was almost over and that once it finished he planned to go to Jackson with Joel's brother and his wife. Joel agreed that Jackson was the best decision and that he also intended to go there to live a normal life in a community, away from Fedra or the army. Quarantine zones were unattractive and were slowly beginning to collapse. Naruto accepted that fact. The quarantine zones were falling apart. Nobody could keep them running without serious resources or competent military or governmental support. Even Boston's quarantine, which had lasted those 20 years, was starting to crumble, as the Fireflies' attack had shown. Living in communities like Jackson, Naruto thought, seemed like the best hope for peace. St. Mary Hospital had become the Fireflies' base of operations. After they had taken the east side of the University of Colorado, the hospital sat empty of civilians and uninfected survivors and had no sign of the military presence that had occupied other facilities. For 10 years Marlene ran the hospital as her headquarters, keeping it distant from any quarantine zones or dangerous hordes that might force them to abandon it, as had happened with the university. To prevent incursions, Marlene cleared the hospital's surroundings, removed bodies from the depths of the building, and sealed off any underground access with iron gates. Inside, the Fireflies claimed the abandoned medical equipment and generators that would keep the area powered. The noise of such machines could attract nearby infected, and Marlene addressed that immediately. Ordinary infected could not break through an iron gate. They lacked the strength or cunning. The real threat came from the larger, more dangerous infected, and the Fireflies prioritized protecting the generators from them. They neutralized those threats with coordinated attacks using flamethrowers and rifles with armor-piercing rounds, relying on precise tactics rather than brutality. Marlene was focused on her people and the mission ahead, on the objectives that came with leading the group she believed could save the world. The weapons recovered in Boston and the girl her friend had entrusted to her an immune adolescent were the tools she needed to pursue that goal. This time, Marlene was determined not to repeat past mistakes. She would tie up every loose end and set aside feelings and weaknesses that had plagued her before. From the moment she left Ellie with Joel and Tess, Marlene had worried that the girl might not end up back under her control. Circumstances, though, had forced her to change her plans, and while she had not anticipated the two smugglers, she had found no better people to bring Ellie to her. What surprised her most when she saw Ellie and Joel near the hospital was Tess's absence and the presence of a teenager whom Marlene's men had subdued with a blow to the back of the head. Marlene did not know if Tess was dead, and she felt detached from any such outcome. She felt nothing when her men had struck a teenager or when they had roughed up Joel. The only thing that truly mattered to her was seeing Ellie come under the control of one of her subordinates. She had waited nearly a year for the chance to study Ellie and attempt to turn her immunity into a cure that could fight the infection. Yet Marlene understood the impossibility of fully rebuilding society alone. The world after the outbreak had changed utterly, undoing laws and any civic code that had existed before. Governments and soldiers no longer mattered. Badges meant nothing. Survival under the law of the strongest was the reality Marlene had used to make herself leader of the Fireflies, eliminating rivals who did not share her objectives. The sounds of groans pulled her out of her thoughts. Her face became a mask of composed satisfaction as she watched both captives stir on their cots. Joel muttered in confusion as he woke, holding his neck where he had been struck. Marlene reassured Joel that everything was fine. Naruto, showing no weakness, asked where they were, his voice steady as his blue eyes scanned the small medical room. The space had just enough room for the two cots side by side and a poster of the human body on the wall. Some parts were missing and others were faded, the letters barely legible, but the directions could still be made out. Beside Joel on the right, a wooden table held several dusty vials, abandoned. Some vials were whole with faint streaks running down their sides. Others looked chewed at as if someone had torn a piece away. Small crystals, covered in dust, were scattered across the table in zigzag lines. Someone had been playing with them, perhaps imagining them as cars or tokens. Marlene answered that it was St. Mary Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah, and she looked at the boy for a few seconds. That look caught the blond man's attention. Their brown and blue eyes met for a moment before Marlene broke eye contact and turned her attention to Joel. She explained that they had found them at the hospital doors and offered a regretful apology for what her people had done. They had mistaken them for bandits, or possibly soldiers. Joel muttered that it did not look that bad and asked about Ellie, wanting to know if she was all right. Neither adult noticed that Naruto's fingers were gripping the edge of the gurney, nails digging in until his knuckles paled from the strain. Marlene informed them that Ellie had already been taken into surgery for study and that the procedure would begin soon. She stepped away from the gurneys to give both of them space to stand. Joel said they would wait and that they would take her once Marlene had finished with her tests and that they planned to return for her. Marlene shook her head and asked if Joel did not understand. Naruto interrupted sharply, saying that Ellie would not simply get up and walk out of the operating room, not like they had seen happen on other occasions with another girl. His voice was harsh and urgent. Two Fireflies grabbed Naruto by the shoulders and shoved him against the wall. The taller of the two put his forearm against Naruto's neck in a pressure hold, forcing him to quiet down. Marlene told them there was no need to fight, then gave a small, controlled gesture to her men. They eased off Naruto but kept him restrained. Marlene stated that Ellie had made her choice by coming this far and that she would be part of the vaccine effort. Joel asked if they had asked Ellie, and Marlene said it was unnecessary. Naruto exploded in anger, but Joel raised a hand and stopped him. He sighed, sat on a gurney, and suggested that Marlene intended to send forces from the hospital to ensure they would not interfere. Marlene confirmed that she would, without weapons but leaving them alive, since Joel and his companion had brought Ellie to the Fireflies. She warned that if they returned, her men would kill them. They were equipped, trained, and better than those from Boston. They should consider them the Fireflies' elite. With a final look and one last practice gesture, Marlene left the room, leaving Joel and Naruto in the hands of the men who would escort them out of the area, away from Ellie and without the chance to stop her. A soldier ordered them to release him. The man stepped back after a shove. Naruto took a step forward and the soldier responded, but Joel restrained Naruto with a tired, resigned motion. The soldier's partner had already reached for his pistol. The soldier announced that they were going to escort them out and motioned for them to move. Outside the room, a squad of 8 waited, making a total of 10 soldiers including the 2 inside. They surrounded Joel and Naruto on all sides and began pushing them gently toward the elevator. Surrounded, Naruto scanned the 10 men. They carried assault rifles with sound suppressors to avoid attracting infected, sidearms secured in holsters at their right hips, and ballistic vests with various pockets like ordinary military gear. They wore no helmets, but their green trousers and dark boots made them look very much like soldiers or Fedra personnel, suggesting they had salvaged that equipment. Marlene had not lied about their being well-equipped. Every Firefly among them wore a weapon. They even had military knives sheathed at their belts, ready for quick use. They were prepared for combat in every form: knives up close, rifles and pistols at medium range, and long-range rifles for distance. Marlene had trained them for a fight, for war. Naruto wondered if these soldiers could have survived 7 years on their own and adapted to the world's harshness. Naruto inhaled deeply, filling his chest with oxygen, then exhaled slowly. One of the soldiers barked in order to move. Naruto was the first to act. Joel struck a man with his backpack, knocking him over and vaulting over the counter. In a swift, anime-like flurry of motion, Naruto seized a knife and moved with precise, rapid strikes that swiftly incapacitated 2 of the soldiers. He then grabbed a pistol and a rifle, using them with practiced efficiency to take down 3 more while Joel fired his revolver to fend off the remaining attackers. The scene unfolded like a tense, stylized fight, focused on skill and timing rather than gore. Breathing hard and holding the pistol, Naruto trained the muzzle on Joel's face. Joel matched the gesture without flinching at the sight of the barrel. Naruto said that he should kill Joel, accusing him of bringing Ellie and wanting her dead. Joel, startled, blinked as if understanding had just reached him. He slowly lowered his weapon, and Naruto used the pause to press the pistol more firmly under Joel's chin, forcing him to exhale. Joel stated that he wanted to save Ellie. He insisted that if he had wanted her dead, he would not have been knocked out or fired on to protect them, and told Naruto that he loved Ellie like a daughter. He added that he had never expected her to end up with Marlene. The pistol trembled slightly under Joel's chin and then the cold touch eased. Joel lowered his head and finally drew a deep breath. Naruto murmured that he had never been a Firefly and reached under his shirt to reveal a locket. When he opened it, a photograph appeared inside, a memory of someone who had been used in Marlene's experiments and who had died without the effect Marlene had been seeking. Naruto explained that the woman in the photograph had been like Ellie. Joel absorbed that information. Naruto said he would prevent that outcome, another unnecessary death taken for the sake of trying to save a broken world. Naruto declared that he would take anyone in his path. Joel and Naruto stared at each other with an intensity that left no room for doubt. There was no resentment in Joel's eyes. The cold determination in the teenager's gaze swallowed everything. Naruto's blue eyes shone like the winter they had endured months before arriving at the hospital. Joel understood from that exchange that he could not stop Naruto, even if he wanted to. There was no one in the world who could. A hospital alarm began to wail and red lights flooded the corridors. A soldier shouted that something had been spotted. Joel dropped to cover while Naruto lifted the M16, holding it with both hands, the butt against his right shoulder and his finger poised by the trigger. Naruto switched the rifle to burst fire and fired 3 quick shots. One soldier went down and another immediately hunched over his arm, clearly wounded. Naruto moved the rifle and fired another 3-round burst, aiming for unprotected limbs and exposed areas to neutralize threats swiftly and efficiently. He showed no hesitation. Naruto thought of Ellie as he changed an empty magazine for a fresh one. The hallway was strewn with bodies and the signs of the firefight. Alarms and red light continued to fill the air. Joel stood, grabbed several spare magazines from a fallen soldier, and told Naruto that he would open a path to where Ellie might be and that Naruto should cover him. Joel said he would watch the halls, rooms, and any hiding places where soldiers loyal to Marlene might be, and he asked Naruto to have his back. Joel agreed to cover and confirmed he had taken the backpack and weapons. He added that he was carrying Billy's shotgun and the sword. Naruto nodded without speaking and moved down the corridor, stepping over fallen soldiers with his rifle ready to fire another 3-round burst if needed. Naruto had not learned this from David, his father, or anyone formal. This behavior was the product of a hard life and relentless learning. He had trained his mind to anticipate the moves of a soldier, to think through every possibility like a chessboard, and to act ahead of them. He advanced without hesitation. When a bullet grazed his left cheek, he felt a hot sting but kept moving, focused on the target. He returned fire without pausing. Joel called out that they had found an operating room. Naruto stopped, backed toward the opening, and raised his rifle again to cover Joel. Joel pointed out that 2 wooden doors were closed at the end of a short hall. Light showed through the windows in the doors. Naruto scanned the area and noticed there were no additional guards nearby. The absence of more soldiers felt strange given what had just happened. Joel told Naruto to go ahead. Joel pushed the doors open with force, the impact cracking glass in the frames, and Naruto followed, slinging his rifle behind him and drawing his pistol from its holster. They entered a room where a single man wearing surgical attire stood near a gurney. Ellie lay on the gurney in a hospital gown with an oxygen mask in place, likely sedated. She looked fragile and pale under the surgical lights. The surgeon stepped forward and announced that they would not allow Ellie to be taken because she was their salvation. Naruto and Joel raised their pistols and aimed at the surgeon. The two nurses kept their distance, pressed against the instrument table they had planned to use for the operation. The young man hissed that there was no salvation, calling the surgeon a fool and accusing him of having already killed other girls. The surgeon growled that the young man could not know that, and argued that if they stopped trying to save the world they would lose what made them human. Joel told the man to step aside and tried to move toward Ellie, but the man stepped forward and pointed a scalpel at him. Joel begged him to please move. The surgeon insisted that he would not allow them to take her. A single gunshot rang out, chilling the room. The surgeon made a few pained noises and then collapsed. The scalpel clattered from his hand and a dark stain spread beneath him. Naruto announced that he would take Ellie and ordered the young man to cover him. He trained his pistol on the two nurses. They crouched, trembling, staring at their fallen colleague and the dark stain beneath him. Frozen and silent, they let Joel lift Ellie and let Naruto aim without firing. Joel pushed the door open with his shoulder and ran out of the operating room. Footsteps and voices echoed and grew louder. Naruto glanced once at the fallen surgeon, then followed Joel, holstering his pistol and reclaiming his assault rifle. They ran, hearing their pursuers close behind, the sound of gunfire, bullets striking walls, glass, and scattered gurneys. Naruto halted twice to lay down covering fire, forcing the soldiers to take cover. In the exchanges he managed to hit a few of their pursuers, wounding or knocking them down and thinning the number of Fireflies in pursuit. He swapped magazines on the move and kept pace with Joel. At one point he fired to disable two more soldiers, stepping over the incapacitated men and leaping across an overturned gurney. When he landed he grabbed his pistol and put down two more Fireflies, stopping them at the entrance to the corridor that should lead out of the facility. He holstered the pistol and continued. Joel waited at the end of another corridor, repeatedly pressing the elevator call button. The indicator blinked and the elevator arrived. Joel kept pressing even as the doors began to open. Naruto shoved Joel into the elevator, raised his rifle, and fired at 3 soldiers to force them to seek cover. The doors shut with a soft click. Joel selected the top floor, the hospital parking level. Naruto checked his pockets for another magazine and found none. He unclipped the sling from the rifle and left it on the elevator floor. He took Joel's backpack, pulled out the Glock, and confirmed it was loaded and had spare magazines. He told Joel that if there were Fireflies in the parking he would deal with them, that both pistols were ready and that Joel should run, put Ellie in a car and not wait. He had to get Ellie to Jackson and not look back. Joel was silent for a few seconds as the elevator descended from the 3rd floor to the ground. Naruto wished Joel luck. Joel said he did not believe in luck. The elevator doors opened and Naruto stepped out first, scanning left and right with a weapon in each hand. The St. Mary parking garage was empty of Fireflies. Only military, civilian cars, and a few ambulances sat under layers of dust so thick someone could have drawn on them. Joel said they would take a car that still seemed usable and drive to Jackson. Joel settled Ellie on the back seat with her head on her small backpack. Naruto reached for his weapon with fingers brushing the grip. Marlene called out that they should not do it. Naruto turned, hand close to his rifle, and acknowledged her. Marlene argued that Ellie could be the salvation, glancing at Joel's revolver as if he were aiming it. She insisted they could save the world and the people not yet infected. Naruto rejected the certainty, saying there was no guaranteed cure and asking what about Ellie's choice. Marlene countered that choosing her life over the many would be selfish and reminded them that the world was collapsing. The conversation widened into the stark reality of the world. There were no stable governments. The army ruled the quarantine zones with cruelty, and survivors did whatever they had to live. People like David had abandoned any moral restraint. Survival was the only thing that mattered. Naruto knew this too well, more than Marlene and perhaps more than Joel. After 20 years people had adapted to surviving. Rebuilding governments or pre-war society would not undo how people now took what they needed from others. Even if a cure existed, it would not erase the infected or the hardened attitudes that had grown over 2 decades. No one wanted governments, no one needed them. Naruto believed none of it would work. He drew his Isaur M18 and pointed it at Marlene. He accused her of pursuing her experiments without consent, of using people she assumed immune for her studies, and demanded whether she had ever asked. Joel asked whether Naruto had ever stopped to think, accusing him of having killed another girl, the daughter of a man who wanted to take his head, and saying that the girl had not wanted any part of it. Marlene shouted that it was for a greater good. Naruto squeezed the trigger and the gun fired. The shot struck Marlene and she staggered, then fell to the floor as the boy stood over her with intense blue eyes. Naruto pressed the barrel of the gun to the leader's forehead and told her that she would never stop searching for immune children and using them as test subjects, that she inspired only pity. Another shot echoed in the room. Marlene whispered Naruto's name. Naruto dropped the pistol and turned toward Joel, offering a sad, melancholy smile. He said he supposed Jackson was their destination and that he would not go with them, because he did not deserve it. Naruto explained that he had always been a lone survivor, and that this had been only a phase. He tightened his backpack straps, comforted by the familiar weight of his katana, weapons, and supplies. Joel told him he should come. Naruto laughed dryly and insisted it would not be sensible, calling himself a monster. He shook his head and extended his hand. Joel regarded it with suspicion. Naruto asked Joel to tell Ellie that it had been good traveling with them, and then added that this was a goodbye. Joel gripped the boy's hand firmly and said it was more of a see you later, not a goodbye. He told Naruto that Maria and Tommy would want him to come to Jackson, even if only for a visit. Naruto scoffed that he would come only for Christmas. Joel said that would be enough.